On Sunday, May 23, 1982, roommates Lori Lister, 21, and Melinda Aguilar, 18, experienced a terrifying attack in their Houston, Texas apartment. A man appeared to specifically target them, seemingly with the intention of killing them. He tied the two women up and to drown Lori in the bathtub. However, Melinda managed to escape by pretending to faint and then leaping headfirst from the balcony. She sought help, and with the assistance of a neighbor, both she and Lori were rescued. The attacker was 28-year-old Cora Watts, who was arrested as he attempted to flee. What no one could have predicted, though, was that Watts was not only involved in these two attempted murders, but was also suspected of having killed nearly 100 other women. He confessed to killing 13 women and was sentenced to 60 years in 1982. However, a shocking twist came in the early 2000s. Despite his gruesome crimes, Watts was nearly set free. This was due to a controversial legal ruling that reclassified him as a nonviolent felon. Under Texas law, well-behaved nonviolent felons could earn time off their sentence, 3 days for every day served. As a model prisoner, Watts had accumulated enough time off his sentence that, by May 9, 2006, he could have been released. The news left police, victims' families, and the public in shock and fear. Lingering questions haunted everyone involved. How could this be happening? Would he truly be released back into society? Why would this killer be set free? How could a serial murderer, responsible for so many deaths, be released from custody? Carl Eugene Watts, who went by the name Coral, was born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, to Richard Eugene Watts and Dorothy Mae Young. His father served as a private first class in the Army, while his mother worked as a kindergarten art teacher. Before Watts turned 2, his parents separated, and he was raised by his mother. The family moved to Inkster, Michigan, where Dorothy later remarried a mechanic named Norman Caesar. Together, they had 2 daughters. When Watts was 8, he and his sister contracted meningitis, a life-threatening illness that caused him to be held back a year in school, preventing him from completing the 3rd grade. Hermann Kiefer Hospital became Watts' temporary home, where he underwent spinal taps and had to be isolated from other patients. Reports from journalists suggested that Watts' body temperature reached alarming levels, raising concerns about potential brain damage. Following his illness, his family noticed a transformation in his personality. He became bashful, quiet, and introverted, with a compromised attention span and a deteriorating memory. Struggling to keep up academically due to being held back a grade and suffering from chronic sleeplessness, Watts began having violent dreams about combating and killing malevolent spirits of women, and these disrupted his sleep cycle. When questioned later about his motives for killing, Watts claimed he wanted to release the spirits of his victims, believing they had evil eyes. At the age of 12, he began fantasizing about torturing and killing girls and young women while sleeping. It was during his teenage years that he started stalking girls, and it's believed he may have killed his first victim before turning 15. At 15, Watts was identified by the police as the attacker of 26-year-old Joan Gave on July 29, 1969. During his newspaper delivery route, Watts knocked on Joan's door and, upon her opening it, violently assaulted her. Without any apparent remorse, he resumed his delivery route as though nothing had happened. Joan immediately contacted the authorities and reported the assault, which led to Cora's arrest at his home. As a result, he was sent to the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit for psychiatric treatment. A psychiatric evaluation revealed that he had a mild intellectual disability with an IQ of 75 and a delusional thought process. Despite his poor academic performance, a police officer later described him as exceptionally intelligent with an excellent memory. Watts was released from the Lafayette Clinic on November 7, 1969. Despite academic struggles, Watts graduated from high school in 1973 and earned a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. However, he was expelled after 3 months due to allegations of stalking and assaulting women. Additionally, Suspicion surrounded Watson the cruel murder of a female student, contributing to his expulsion, although insufficient evidence prevented a conviction. Following his expulsion, he relocated to Houston, Texas. In 1979, Correll Watts and his girlfriend, Dolores Howard, welcomed their daughter, Nikisha Watts. However, shortly after her birth, Correll and Dolores ended their relationship and went separate ways. Correll then married Valeria Goodwill. Soon after their marriage, Valeria began to notice strange behaviors in Correll. He would constantly rearrange the furniture, use knives to mutilate houseplants, break candles and melt them onto the table, and scatter trash around the house without cleaning it up. Additionally, after moments of intimacy, he would abruptly leave, disappearing for hours. Unfortunately, their marriage only lasted 6 months. Watts' murder spree officially began when he was 20 years old in 1974, though there are suspicions he may have had other victims before this time. He would kidnap his victims from their homes, subject them to torture, and then murder them. Operating in various states, his victims were mainly thin, attractive white women, aged between 14 and 44. Watts used different methods to murder his victims, including strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning, and drowning. At 10:45 a.m. on October 25, 1974, Correll knocked on 23-year-old Leonore Nasaki's apartment door. Claiming to be looking for Charles, the name of one of his siblings, he engaged Leonore in conversation. When she opened the door with the chains still secured, Correll asked if he could leave a note. As she went to fetch paper, he suddenly attacked Nasaki and choked her into unconsciousness. Although Leonore later alerted police, they were unable to locate her assailant. 5 days later, on October 30, 1974, Watts tortured and ruthlessly killed 20-year-old Gloria Steele, believed to be his second victim. A student at Western Michigan University, Gloria was also a mother. She was found with a crushed windpipe and 33 stab wounds to her chest, inflicted by a wooden carving instrument. He didn't face a direct charge due to a lack of solid evidence. The only witness, Diane K. Williams, an apartment resident manager, observed a black man searching for Charles around the apartment complex. Upon seeing Williams, Correll seized her, forced her door open, and dragged her inside. During their struggle, Williams' phone rang, prompting her to knock it off the hook and scream for help. As her attacker fled, Williams saw him getting into a tan Pontiac Grand Prix. In a police lineup, both Williams and Nozaki identified Correll, who had been apprehended for stealing plywood from the Western Michigan University campus. For the Nozaki and Williams cases, he was taken into custody and charged with assault and battery on November 16, 1974. After being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and attempting to take his own life with a length of court at the Kalamazoo Mental Hospital, Watts was relocated to the Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Michigan. When questioned about the death of Gloria Steele in 1975, he admitted being nearby the day before Gloria died. However, he denied being responsible for her death, despite confessing to attacking approximately 15 other young women. A search at Watts' residence by Detroit police, conducted under a search warrant, revealed a wooden carving tool, but no evidence linking him to Gloria's death. During his trial for the assault and battery of Nasaki and Williams, Watts entered a no-contest plea and was subsequently sentenced to a year in the county jail. Psychologists evaluating him characterized Watts as extremely hazardous, lacking remorse for his crimes, reckless, careless, and emotionally distant, with a high likelihood of relapsing. After that, a series of attacks occurred in the Detroit region over the span of a year, where he claimed the lives of 5 women. One peculiar discovery was that the majority of his crimes happened on Sunday mornings. This odd pattern earned the perpetrator the ominous nickname Sunday Morning Slasher for Ann Arbor newspaper, heightening the mystery surrounding the timing of these horrifying attacks, all occurring at around 4 a.m. In 1980, Shirley Small, a 17-year-old from Ann Arbor, Michigan, was fatally stabbed twice outside her home on April 20th. A similar attack targeted Glenda Richmond, 26, on July 13, 1980. Both cases lacked sufficient evidence for conviction, but exhibited Watts' characteristics. The first homicide directly attributed to Laurel occurred on September 14, 1980, when 20-year-old graduate student Rebecca Hoth was found dead, having endured around 50 stab wounds. A 20-year-old named Delphi survived an attack on October 6, 1980, but suffered severe consequences, including partial paralysis and muscle weakness. On November 1, 1980, a 30-year-old woman, Agnes, narrowly escaped an attack by a hooded man resembling Watts after raising the alarm while returning from a Halloween party. Although she identified Watts from photos, the dimly lit surroundings left uncertainty. In July 1980, homicide investigators turned their attention to Watts, prompting the formation of a task force to delve into the Sunday slashings. Watts came under sporadic surveillance, and in November, a court order allowed officers to install a tracking device on his car. On November 15, 1980, around 5 in the morning, 2 patrol officers near Main Street, and Erbert observed a suspicious man in a car following a woman walking home. Realizing she was being tailed, the woman sought refuge in a doorway in an attempt to elude or pursue her. Coral, frustrated by losing track of the woman, was apprehended by the police when they pulled over his car for outdated license plates and driving with a suspended license. During the inspection of his vehicle, authorities found a package containing wood-filling equipment and a few screwdrivers. Their most significant dictionary belonging to Rebecca Hoth, bearing the carved phrase, "Rebecca is a lover." However, it proved insufficient evidence to link him directly to her murder. In the spring of 1981, Corral relocated to Columbus, Texas, and secured employment with an oil firm. During the weekends, he would travel over 70 miles to his next hunting ground in the Houston region. Between 1974 and 1982, Watts committed murders of numerous women, totaling dozens. Despite the extensive list of victims, Watts managed to evade detection as a serial killer for nearly 8 years. Several factors contributed to this elusiveness. Watts operated across various jurisdictions and even different states, complicating the task of connecting the crimes. Additionally, his modus operandi diverged from typical patterns as he never engaged in physical intimacy with his victims, unlike many other serial killers targeting women and girls. Consequently, even with the emergence of DNA testing, linking the crimes proved challenging. Furthermore, Watts was not considered a suspect by those who knew him, and law enforcement did not identify him as a potential perpetrator until his arrest in 1982. On May 23, 1982, Melinda Aguilar, 18, and Lori Lister, 21, experienced a break-in at their Houston apartment by Watts. When Lori came back from work, Watts choked her down the steps outside the apartment. Subsequently, he entered the apartment and began strangling Melinda. Pretending to be unconscious, Melinda managed to escape being strangled completely. Watts wire-tied her hands behind her back with the intent to drown Lori. He carried Lori's body upstairs to the bathroom, filling the bathtub with water. However, Melinda seized the opportunity and leaped out of the window to seek help. Lori was saved and Watts was apprehended after he initially tried evading capture. While he was in custody, investigators started linking him to recent killings of women. Despite the connections, Texas prosecutors believed there was insufficient evidence to secure a murder conviction against Watts. In May 1982, following the attacks on Melinda Aguilar and Lori Lister, Harris County Assistant District Attorney Ira Jones negotiated a plea bargain. Watts would admit fully to his crimes, receiving immunity from murder in exchange for a charge of burglary with intent to murder. He agreed to a 60-year sentence for this offense. Watts accepted the deal, leading detectives to the graves of 3 victims. Finally, Watts confessed to attacking 19 women, resulting in the murder of 13. He admitted to killing some victims but also refrained from confessing to the deaths for a few. However, Michigan authorities declined to participate in the deal, leaving his cases in that state open. However, the hope for justice took a devastating turn when, shortly into his prison term, the Texas Court of Appeals ruled that Watts had not been informed that the bathtub and water he used in the attempt to drown were considered deadly weapons. This decision reclassified him as a nonviolent felon and eventually opened the door to early release. This was because Texas law at the time granted nonviolent felons 3 days deducted from their sentences for every 1 day served with good behavior. Watts, a model prisoner, accumulated time deductions that could have seen him released as early as May 9, 2006. The subsequent of the early release law prompted by public outcry brought little solace as it couldn't be retroactively applied as dictated by the Texas Constitution. In February 2004, a plea for justice echoed across the nation as Attorney General Mike Cox sought information to convict Watts of murder and prevent his potential release. Joseph Foy from Westland, Michigan bravely stepped forward, recounting the chilling sight of a man resembling Watts murdering 36-year-old Helen Dutcher on December 1, 1979. Helen had succumbed to 12 stab wounds. Foy identified Watts by his eyes, hauntingly describing them as evil and devoid of emotion. Despite Watts' immunity from prosecution for the 13 confessed killings in Texas, Michigan held no such agreement. As the February 2004 trial neared, law enforcement officials urged the trial judge to allow the Texas confessions to be admitted as evidence, a request that was granted. Watts was convicted for the murders of Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele, receiving 2 life sentences without parole in a Michigan prison on November 17, 2004. He was placed in a maximum security facility in Ionia, Michigan. However, a few years into his sentence, he succumbed to prostate cancer on September 21, 2007, in a hospital in Jackson, Michigan. Ultimately, Watts avoided serving his full sentence for the lives he had taken, leaving behind a tragic conclusion to his dark and violent story. Coral Eugene Watts, a vicious serial killer, spread fear across the country with his numerous murders. Despite his confessions, legal loopholes led to a reduced sentence and nearly allowed his release. His later conviction for the 1979 murder of Helen Dutcher revealed the true extent of his depravity. Watts remains a chilling reminder of concealed evil, with the Ann Arbor murders remaining unsolved, casting a long, eerie shadow over his legacy. The 1970s were marked by the rise of bell-bottoms, disco music, and the growing popularity of cassette tapes. However, it was also a time shadowed by fear, especially in America, where the chilling crimes of figures like Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy sent ripples of terror through society. Amid this unsettling era, many cases of missing children and murders went unnoticed, some still unsolved to this day. One such case was that of Brian Douglas McDermott, a 10-year-old boy from Belfast who disappeared in 1973. Described as a quiet child, Brian was the youngest of 5 children born to Edward and Joan McDermott. On the afternoon of September 2, 1973, he left his home on Wells Street in the Lower Woodstock Road area to play with friends at the park. He was expected back for Sunday lunch at 2:30 p.m., but he never returned. His parents, immediately concerned, contacted the authorities, who quickly organized a search. The search party scoured the surrounding areas, including derelict buildings and the Tullymore Forest Park, but no sign of Brian could be found. A week later, on September 8th, authorities turned their attention to the River Lagan. The water was lowered to allow a more thorough investigation, and what they discovered was every parent's worst nightmare. A sack containing parts of Brian McDermott's dismembered body was found. Although 1 arm and 2 legs were missing, investigators were unable to recover them despite their best efforts. The missing limbs remain a mystery to this day. The body was also burned, leading authorities to suspect that after the slaying, the perpetrator had attempted to disguise Brian's true identity by burning his flesh. Local parents feared for the safety of their children, terrified that a killer walked among them. While the McDermott family fell to pieces and began to grieve for their lost child and brother, Brian was laid to rest on September 33. While thousands of interviews were carried out, tips were thoroughly investigated, and a huge manhunt for the culprit was carried out. The police felt like they were running out of leads. They reportedly looked for sectarian links, pedophile rings, and witchcraft theories, but none of them turned up any promising leads. They also briefly considered links to the Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast. This was due to the idea in 1982 that Brian's case concerns, quote, possible homosexual aspects. The home was the scene of numerous serious sexual abuse allegations which led to a massive scandal and attempted cover-up in 1980. There were even rumors about state collusion and whisperings that a pedophile ring was operating from inside the home which had links to intelligence services. However, there has never been any established connection between Brian's case and the boys' home. The authorities looked into 16-year-old William McDermott, Brian's older brother. They had suspected that perhaps he had taken childish revenge on his younger sibling after Brian had hit him in the back with a stick. The police had had their eye on him for a while, but it wasn't until 1976 that they were able to pull him in for questioning when his mother reported him for beating her. William did confess during questioning, but quickly recanted this admission of guilt, and ever since, he has maintained his innocence and claimed that in February 8, his ex-wife told a court in Worcester that he had admitted to ending Brian's life. This was heard during a hearing over William sending his ex-wife threatening and abusive texts. William has other convictions for violent offenses but continues to maintain his innocence. Brian's older brother, Eddie, who was 19 at the time of his disappearance, has acted as the family's spokesman over the years. He has publicly stated that the family are estranged from William, having cut ties with him long ago. Eddie in particular believes that William is guilty of what happened to Brian, in claiming that he grew suspicious when William said that he didn't want a book published about Brian's case when a writer approached the family in February 3. He even went so far as to contact his local MP asking for him to put a stop to it. According to Eddie, William began to deteriorate after this, growing more aggressive and dangerous. In 1993, the Irish newspaper, The Sunday Life, received an anonymous letter and drawing of a suspect in connection with the case. A letter received by authorities in the aftermath of Brian McDermott's death suggested that the man depicted in a drawing might have lived near where Brian was last seen, even providing an address. However, this lead seemed to have gone nowhere, and the case remained largely overshadowed by the ongoing troubles in Ireland at the time. As a result, details about the investigation into Brian's murder remained scarce. In February 2003, it was reported that the police had not ruled out possible connections to witchcraft, but no conclusive evidence emerged. The tragic loss of their son led to a downward spiral for Brian's parents. Joan and Edward McDermott struggled with grief and turned to alcohol, as the family lived on the brink of emotional collapse. Joan McDermott, in particular, held on to the belief that her son William was involved in some way, a conviction she maintained until her death in February 2004. The case of Brian McDermott remains unsolved to this day. Anyone with information is urged to contact Crime Stoppers at 080-555-111. On February 13, 2017, best friends Abigail Williams, 13, and Liberty German, 14, planned a hike at the scenic Monon High Bridge Trail, located east of their small town of Delphi, Indiana. The day before, Abigail had stayed at Liberty's home for a sleepover. Liberty lived primarily with her grandparents, Mike and Becky Patty. Since school had been canceled that Monday, the two friends asked Liberty's grandmother if they could go hiking, and permission was granted as long as they arranged for transportation to and from the trail. Liberty's older sister, Kelsey German, dropped the girls off at 1:30 p.m. on her way to work, and they planned for Liberty's father, Derek German, to pick them up after completing a few errands, which would take about 2 hours. At 2:07 p.m., Liberty decided to record their hike. The girls took some pictures and posted one to Snapchat, showing Abigail smiling as she crossed the abandoned Monon High Bridge. At 3:11 p.m., Derek texted Liberty, asking them to start heading back to the meeting point for pickup. However, when Derek arrived at 3:14 p.m., he was shocked to find that the girls were nowhere to be seen. Derek continued to text and call Liberty multiple times but received no response. Growing increasingly worried, he decided to walk along the trail in search of the girls. After about 15 minutes with no success, he called Liberty's grandmother, Becky, to inform her that the girls were missing. The family spent about an hour searching the trail but found no signs of the girls. As darkness began to set in, they officially reported them missing to the police around 5 p.m. By 6 p.m., a large-scale search effort began. Authorities, along with over 100 local residents, scoured the trail that evening. The next day, February 14th, around noon, a volunteer searcher discovered the bodies of Abigail and Liberty near Deer Creek, roughly half a mile from the bridge where they were last seen in pictures. Authorities have not disclosed the cause of death or whether the girls were sexually assaulted. However, they released two compelling images of a prime suspect, believed to be the person responsible for their deaths. One of the images was captured by Liberty herself, while she was recording Abigail during their hike. The suspect appeared to be a middle-aged Caucasian male wearing a windbreaker or some type of coat, denim blue jeans, a brown hat, brown shoes or boots, and a brown undergarment which may be clothing or a fanny pack. 3 days later, on February 22, 2017, another clue was made public when police unveiled a 3-second audio clip of a male saying, quote, "Down the hill." This was recorded from Liberty's phone. "Get down the hill. Get down the hill." Authorities stated that the audio recording started off as, quote, "normal girl stuff talking and laughing," but when they saw the man on the bridge, the audio captured the girls becoming nervous and worried. It is believed that the girls initially saw the man while entering the trail and forgot about him by the time that they walked the bridge. When the man appeared again on the bridge, the girls may have sensed an impending danger. At one point, Liberty may have decided to click the picture of the suspect and conceal her phone while doing so at her side in her successful attempt to capture the suspect on tape. It is believed that the suspect was unaware of the phone as it was recovered at the crime scene. A hill is located next to the bridge, which is likely what the suspect is referring to in the audio tapes when he says, quote, "down the hill." The bodies of the young teens were found across the very shallow creek which flows at the bottom of the hill. It is unclear but theorized that given the shallowness of the water, the girls crossed over the creek and were murdered on the other side. Other theories postulate that the girls had already been murdered and were dragged or carried across the shallow water. In July of 2017, a witness came forward and reported that they had seen the suspect in the area around the same time the girls had been murdered. A composite sketch was created and released, and police stated that the suspect had reddish-brown hair, stood between 5'6" and 5'10", and weighed between 8 pound 180,220. The eyewitness was uncertain of the suspect's exact eye color but is confident that they were not blue. In September of 2017, a possible suspect was identified and Daniel Jane Nations was arrested at a traffic stop in Colorado. Nations, a registered sex offender in Indiana, was driving a car with expired Indiana license plates at the time of his arrest. Nations was arrested in Woodland Park for threatening people with a hatchet on Monument Hiking Trail. A bicyclist was also fatally shot on that trail around the same time Nations was allegedly threatening people. In his car, a red Chevy Prism, there was a hatchet and a .22 caliber rifle. Nations had a lengthy criminal record including domestic violence, possession of marijuana, driving with a suspended license, failure to appear in court, and pleasuring himself in a woman's restroom at a gas station. Although he was a person of interest in the case, police eventually ruled him out as the killer. Since February 1437, the day after the girls were murdered, Nations, a registered homeless sex offender, was present for his weekly checkup with authorities and had been consistently attending in the time prior. Nations was sentenced to 3 years probation on January 5, 2018 for the charge of threatening hikers in Colorado. In more recent years, police have funneled $1 million into pursuing various leads, sometimes local and sometimes far-flung, and it could be these excess funds spent which make those close to the case angry that the true killer was under their noses the entire time, working in the very area the girls went missing at a local CVS. Unbeknownst to the public, a spent but unused bullet casing was found in between the bodies of Abby and Libby. This can happen when the gun is cocked and then uncocked and then cocked again. The spent shell casing is dispensed from the gun, although the bullet is still encased. When the shell casing is ejected from the gun, it leaves specific trace scratches and indentations which can be traced back to the gun from which it was ejected. It is theorized that the killer cocked the gun and used it as a threat, possibly by putting it towards the head of one of the victims or another instantly fatal zone, and in doing so this may have motivated the victims through fear of their lives to do what the killer was asking. At some point in the attack, the killer must have disengaged the gun but later would go on to rack it again, most likely to continue those same scare tactics. It is in this subsequent engagement of the gun that the unshot bullet would have been released. The bullet was later traced to a gun registered to Richard Matthew Allen, a resident of Delphi and a husband and father. Also known as Ricky or Rick Allen, the 50-year-old lived only 5 minutes from the murder scene. Allen admitted that the gun was his, that he had purchased it in February 2001, and that it had been in his possession the entire time. Allen admitted this information freely, possibly without realizing that there was evidence left at the crime scene. After he admitted that the gun had not left his possession nor had it been borrowed by a friend, he was arrested. Later it was revealed that he had admitted to a park ranger in the initial investigation that he had been in that area. The probable cause affidavit released a few days after Allen's arrest stated that there was further footage that police have not released that ties Allen to the crime. Those working the case first spoke with Allen in February 2017, claims the affidavit, but Allen may not have been seen as a suspect until more recently due to a clerical error in the tips. But in a later interview, the FBI denies that such a clerical error has occurred and states that all proper protocols were followed in categorizations and filing about the tip about Richard Allen, which was originally received early on in the investigation, was properly handled. Libby's grandmother recalls that Richard Allen, who sometimes worked the photo booth at CBS, printed photos of the girls to be used at their funeral free of charge. Initially, the girls' families looked upon Richard's small act of generosity as evidence of the communal support shown for their daughters. It was only after his arrest that the true sinister meaning was uncovered. Not only does the shell casing tie Richard to the crime scene, but Richard reported that he wore the same clothes as in the Snapchat video segments, which the public studied for years to no avail. Richard admits to being on that trail that day, saying that he arrived sometime around 1:30. Around that same time at 1:26 p.m. that day, witnesses referred to simply as juveniles were in the same area taking pictures, and they saw the same man later shown in the snapshot footage. It is assumed based on the geography of the area that it would take Allen around 10 minutes to walk from the entrance of the park to the bridge. At 1:49 p.m., Abby and Libby were dropped off at that entrance across from Mears Farm. Shortly before that time, an adult witness, labeled Adult Witness Number 1, traveled to the bridge and saw the man, later identified as Richard Allen, standing on the first platform. Roughly 5 minutes after seeing the man, the same adult witness would turn around and, while walking halfway between the bridge and the parking lot area, see Libby and Abby approaching the bridge. At 2:05 p.m. Libby would upload a picture to Snapchat. At 2:07 p.m. Libby would upload a picture of Abby walking on the bridge. The girls first encountered the man who is now supposed to be Richard Allen at 2:13 p.m. Libby's video provides crucial evidence, showing Abby walking across the southeast side of the bridge with a man, who is believed to be Richard, following behind her. As the man nears, one of the girls whispers, "Gun," under her breath, as captured in the Snapchat video. Shortly afterward, the man orders the teenagers to go down the hill, as shown in the video that was later released to the public. Under duress, the girls comply and walk down the hill, and the video abruptly ends. The suspect, who later admitted to being at the scene, claimed he left the park around 3:30 p.m., according to the probable cause affidavit. At 3:57 p.m., a separate witness observed a male subject, covered in mud and blood, walking along the north side of 300 Northway, near the Monon Highway Bridge. Law enforcement has recovered DNA from the crime scene, though it remains unclear whether the DNA definitively matches the offender. A preliminary hearing took place on November 22, 2022, and a jury trial is set to begin on March 20, 2023. The Frankfurt Slasher. An unidentified guy who perpetrated a string of heinous crimes in the Frankfurt neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania between 1985 and 1990 is known by the nickname the Frankfurt Slasher. Transit workers discovered a partially clothed woman's body in a train yard in the northeastern area of Frankfurt on August 26, 1985 at around 8:30 a.m. 52-year-old Helen Payton was the victim, and she met a horrible end. Her legs were wide, her blouse undone, and she was arranged provocatively. It was discovered through subsequent autopsies that she had been sexually raped. Her abdomen had been slit in a way that exposed her organs, and she had suffered 47 stab wounds, the most in the head and chest. But this was only the start of the misery. A few months later, on January 3, 1986, a second body was recovered on Rittenauer Street, block 1400, a short distance from the location of the first victim. Someone discovered Anna Carroll, 68, unconscious on the bedroom floor after noticing her flat door ajar. Similar to Helen, Anna had been positioned by the murderer and found partially naked, starting from her waist down. She was gutted and had 6 stab wounds to her back. The kitchen knife that was used in the assault was still there. From this point on, the savage Frankfurt Slasher did not strike for nearly a whole year. Susanna Osleff, 64, was discovered on Christmas Day 1986 in a manner resembling that of Helen and Anna. Found in her own flat on Richmond Street, she had the same wounds as Anna. A few weeks later, on January 8, 1987, a restaurant employee discovered Jean Durkin's body behind a storage truck on Frankfurt Avenue. She was a 28-year-old homeless lady who had experienced 74 stab wounds as well as sexual abuse. She had been positioned and was nude from the waist down, just like the other victims. Prior to her brother's death in the late 1960s, Jean had led a largely normal life. She started hearing voices after that and was given a paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis. She had been homeless for the previous 5 years and was frequently spotted sleeping in the doorway of an abandoned bakery that was located a few doors down from Goldie's, a neighborhood pub. Authorities were informed by those acquainted with her that she was not a woman who was easily subdued. Because of how badly Jean battled, 6 police officers had already attempted to arrest her before giving up. Because of this, police theorized that she might have known the person who killed her and had dropped her guard. They also found out that the night before the 28-year-old was put to death, she got into a fight with another lady, Michelle Martin, a client of Goldie's, about a blanket. However, Michelle was eventually excluded from the inquiry. Investigators started piecing the puzzle together gradually. The violent and hateful attacks and abuse of 4 women in the Frankfurt neighborhood cannot have happened by accident. Ultimately, a link between all 4 deaths was established by the investigators. Goldie's was a well-liked pub on Frankfurt Avenue where they had all been frequent patrons. The neighborhood had a reputation as a center of nightlife and was widely known for its drug users. Though it hasn't been proved either way, there is conjecture regarding the victims of the slasher being sex workers. After this finding, the area was surveyed and a task force was established by the government. When questioned, a female Goldie's barmaid acknowledged knowing most of the victims, even mentioning that Jean typically came in to stay warm. She said that she thought a customer was responsible for the killings, but she gave no explanation or other information. It was discovered that Susanna frequented the pub 3 days before to her death, and that she was constantly interacting with patrons. But Anna was said to have kept quiet and purchased her own beverages. At this point, the authorities made the decision to inform the media that the crimes had nothing to do with one another. Maybe this was done to keep city dwellers from going into panic. Following this, the killings ceased for a year before resuming in January 1988, following the discovery of Margaret Vaughn's body, then 66 years old. She had been stabbed 29 times when she was found laying in the entrance of her 49,100 apartment block on Penn Street. On this occasion, nevertheless, the investigators were slightly fortunate. A barman remembered seeing Margaret the night before with a middle-aged Caucasian bartender who was described as limping and having a round face and glasses. She remembered enough information to allow for the creation of a composite sketch, which was then circulated across the city. Sadly, despite the police department's plea for assistance, no useful leads were obtained. Teresa Sciortino, 30, was discovered alone in her Erbert Street flat on January 19, 1989. She was found face-up, dressed in only white socks, with stab wounds across her face, chest, and arms. She had suffered sexual assault with a piece of wood in addition to being stabbed 25 times. A bloody shoe print was discovered at the scene, but it was never linked to anyone, and a kitchen knife that was identified as the murder weapon was discovered there. After being questioned by police, the neighbors claimed to have heard a scuffle in her flat, and then a loud thump that sounded like something being thrown to the floor, but they didn't give it much thought at the time and didn't do anything about it. Shortly after 6 p.m., Teresa was allegedly spotted with a middle-aged white man, and this was when the altercation was reported. The 30-year-old was a frequent customer of Goldie's, as was to be anticipated at this stage. After Teresa's death, the Frankfurt Slasher remained silent for more than a year. Not until April 19, 1990 did they launch another attack. Carol Dowd, 46, was found in an alleyway close to a fish market at around 2 in the morning by a patrolling police officer. A slit had exposed her internal organs, and she had sustained 36 stab wounds. But after investigating Carol's past, authorities discovered another significant relationship between a number of their victims. In the years preceding their deaths, Teresa, Carol, and Jean had all been admitted to and discharged from mental hospitals. When Teresa was killed, she was still receiving treatment as an outpatient. After Carol was discovered, police turned their focus to the fish market, where they started questioning the staff. They paid particular attention to Leonard Christopher, a black man who lived nearby and was acquainted with Margaret Vaughn, one of the victims. He claimed to be 39 years old and to have been with his girlfriend the night Carol was killed, but his partner claimed that Carol had been by herself the entire time. Leonard was the most wanted man in law enforcement since he had no alibi, and it didn't take long for them to arrest him. Even though there was no evidence of blood, no motivation, no weapon, and several witnesses had seen the women with white men before to their deaths. On May 5, 1990, Leonard was taken into custody. The witness statements were inconsistent. While 2 witnesses stated they had seen Leonard and Carol stroll into an alley together around the time of her death, many who knew him said he was a fine man and had not been anywhere near the murder locations. The majority of the reports of the man who was last seen with the victims, including Carol herself, did not match his description. The 39-year-old was on trial for murder on June 20th. A few months later, on September 6, 1990, Michelle Martin's, 30, also known as Michelle Dinner, body was discovered in her flat. She had suffered 23 stab wounds. Her body had been positioned, her organs showing. She was a frequent visitor to Goldie's and had recently undergone mental health treatment. She shared a street with Teresa and lived only 3 streets away from Carol. Moreover, this woman was the same one who had argued with Jean the previous evening before Jean's murder. Additionally, Michelle was seen the day before she died with a middle-aged white male who matched the slasher's original description. The jury was not informed of this crime, even though Leonard Christopher was incarcerated awaiting his sentence and could not have committed this murder. On December 12, 1990, Leonard was finally found guilty and given a life sentence, where he eventually passed away from cancer. He preserved his innocence all of his life. Other than Leonard, not much is known about potential suspects in the Frankfurt Slasher case. According to an early 2019 NBC article, a suspect who identified as a minister vanished during a police interrogation, but not before providing DNA samples. At an additional elaboration, a CBS piece states that the offender rented an office at a neighboring church and pretended to be a counselor providing advice and comfort. The police reportedly learned about the death of their main suspect in February 2008. After being questioned, he had gone away, and the killings had ceased. The name of this suspect has never been made public. It appears that there is still no solid evidence linking him to any of the crimes. For a brief period, there was a belief that the Frankfurt Slasher was related to the case of Catherine Jones, a 29-year-old woman who was discovered dead on the street in January of 1987. She had been fatally bludgeoned, yet she was discovered half-dressed and frozen. It seems that the slasher is not thought to be responsible for her situation. It is acknowledged by the case's new investigators that Leonard was most likely unfairly convicted. As of right now, there is still no closure on the Frankfurt Slasher case. Moving on to the next case. Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, both 19 years old, disappeared on August 9, 1980, following their attendance at a wedding event held at Concord House in Concord, Wisconsin. Throughout the next several days, clues were found all throughout the area, including a pair of pants, ropes, Tim's car with his wallet inside, and a pair of women's pants. Eventually, these hints pointed to a terrifying discovery. Tim and Kelly's bodies were discovered in a field, horribly mutilated, 2 months later. After almost 30 years, the culprit was ultimately identified thanks to DNA technological breakthroughs, an unexpected witness, and a dedicated investigator. The man was an ordinary-looking man with dark secrets that not even his neighbors knew about, percent national average. Residents there felt safe, rarely locked their doors, and watched out for one another. It was the exact kind of town that young high school sweethearts Tim Hack and Kelly Drew had imagined themselves growing old beside each other, getting married, and settling on a farm. Tim, who was 19 years old, and Kelly, who was 19, were engaged to be married in 1980. Even though Kelly lives in Fort Atkinson and Tim lives in Hebron, 2 different municipalities within the county, while attending Fort Atkinson High School, their paths intersected. Kelly, a young lady with a strong affinity for cosmetology, was well known for her friendliness and beauty. Tim, a diligent farm lad, on the other hand, was strong and determined. Their loved ones cherished both of these people because of their compassion. Tim and Kelly were role models for other young people while they were a couple. Tim went on to work as a farmer after finishing high school, and his faithful partner was a tractor he called the Lonesome Loser. Kelly, meanwhile, enrolled in beauty school and just finished her studies in 1980 with the goal of becoming a qualified beautician and hairstylist. Tim and Kelly had a wedding celebration at Concord House in Wisconsin on August 9, 1980. They were going to meet up with friends and enjoy a fun fair after the celebration, but they never did show up. They were last seen alive on August 9, 1980 at approximately 11 p.m. when they left the reception. Tim Hack's father, David Hack, became concerned about their disappearance and lack of communication, and on August 10, 1980, he filed a missing persons report. David found Tim's brown Oldsmobile parked at Concord House that same day. Inside was Tim's locked checkbook, jacket, and wallet, which held $67 on August 15th, when searchers found Kelly's pants and knickers at the side of the road, some 3 miles from Concord House. The case took a dramatic turn. It was discovered that these clothes contained male body secretions. Furthermore, military-style knotted ropes were discovered in the vicinity, indicating the presence of a person with prior military experience. The investigation's focus was significantly changed by this revelation. The search for a couple who could have decided to go on a romantic adventure was over. Since they were thought to be in immediate danger, the attention instead shifted to finding them alive. 2 months later, in a wooded region about 7 miles from Concord House, Milwaukee squirrel hunters discovered Kelly Drew's decomposing bones. A fully clothed male body was found around 100 yards away. It was subsequently identified as Tim Hack. This resulted in the case being officially classified as a homicide and being given the moniker Suvart murders. Since no murder weapon was discovered at the site, the precise cause of death was not immediately apparent. However, after more investigation, the medical examiner found that Kelly had ligature marks and that Tim had knife wounds, proving that they had both been strangled and stabbed. Kelly appeared to have been bound, as evidenced by ligature marks on her wrists and ankles. Her neck area showed evidence of insect activity and ligature marks, suggesting that she had most likely been strangled. Body fluids discovered on Kelly's clothing also suggested a sexual assault. Because they were so dramatic, the sweep-up murders captured the attention of the country. 2 young lovers were brutally slain. The murderer or murderers are still at large. Interviewing acquaintances of the couple was the first step in the inquiry, looking for anyone who might have been sufficiently hateful to carry out such a horrific deed. The employees of the Concord House, where the wedding celebration was held, as well as other guests, were questioned by the police. Edward Wayne Edwards, a handyman who works at the Concord House, was one of the people interviewed. Edward, who lived in a neighboring campsite near Interstate 94, asserted that he was not at the Concord residence when the couple vanished and that he had no contact with them. He said that at the time, he was out in the neighboring woods hunting deer. But when the police saw that Edward had a fractured nose, they started to suspect something. When asked about it, he said that his deer hunting expedition was to blame for the injury. Investigators were concerned because Wisconsin's deer shooting season usually lasts from November to August. In September 1980, Edward moved his wife and 5 children out of Wisconsin after being questioned by the police. During the course of the inquiry, the detectives mostly relied on eyewitness reports regarding a dirty-looking vehicle that had been parked next to Tim's automobile at the Concord House parking lot. Witnesses stated that around the time Tim and Kelly were last seen, the vehicle mysteriously and suddenly vanished. Edward was known to have a .357 revolver and occurred to drive a van that fit the description. But the police's ability to follow up on this lead was severely constrained because they didn't have a number plate number or any strong proof connecting him to the crime site. As a result, the investigation was shelved and eventually stagnated because all further leads in it dried up. Richard Lewell, a Wisconsin Department of Justice investigator involved in the initial investigation, asked for the case to be reopened 2 decades after Tim Hack and Kelly Drew were killed. Lewell was determined to solve the case to the end because he had been obsessed with it for almost 30 years and was about to retire. He stated in an interview that he was confident in taking the case further because of the substantial advances made in scientific procedures and DNA technology in the last few decades. His confidence had grown, and he approached the case with increased zeal. Lewell had a gut feeling that the killer had already been questioned by the police in the early phases of the inquiry, and that the person's identity would be in the files. All he had to do was find it. Following 2 months of painstakingly going through witness statements, interview tapes, and files, Lowell's attention was drawn to one name, Edward Wayne Edwards. Not only did Edward have the means and the chance to conduct the crimes, but there were serious concerns raised when he moved his entire family out of Wisconsin just after being questioned by the police. This finding gave Lewell and a group of cold case investigators hope, and they decided to follow their suspicion that Edward might be the murderer. Interviews with Edward's Concord, Wisconsin neighbors revealed that he was a difficult neighbor to live with. He was said to be erratic and short-tempered, and he frequently used violence towards his wife and kids. He was even referred to as a monster by one of his neighbors. John Edwards, Edward's son, described him as disturbed, noting that he was unable to manage his feelings and that there was underlying anger. Edward Balasio's daughter April contacted the police in February 2009 with details about the unsolved murders of Kelly Drew and Tim Hack. Given his long criminal history, she thought her father, Edward Wayne Edwards, was involved in the crime. April felt obligated to reveal what she knew about her father's fascinating life, which had always fascinated her. Born in 1933 in Akron, Ohio, Edward Wayne Edwards experienced a turbulent upbringing following the death of his parents and placement in an institution. His abusive upbringing there influenced his rebellious adolescent personality. Edwards' criminal record started early due to a series of small infractions, which eventually led to his membership in the U.S. Marines at the age of 18. Though Edwards' military tenure was brief and ended in an honorable discharge due to his disappearance shortly after enlisting, he was hesitant to give up his life of crime, which finally resulted in his repeated incarceration. He broke out of Akron jail when he was 22 years old in 1955 and went on a petrol station heist across several states. Edward lived as a vagrant throughout his 20s and 30s, moving about and taking up odd jobs like handyman, ship docker, and Hoover salesman. His love of his reputation during this time is evident in his memoirs. Edward openly acknowledged that he was a fame seeker and had never used a pseudonym or disguised his name while committing crimes. But in 1960, his illegal activities once more caught up with him, and he was imprisoned for trying to pose as a federal officer. Edward was being detained in a jail in Portland, Oregon, but he escaped, leading the FBI to identify him as one of their top 10 most wanted in 1961. He was finally captured by the authorities in 1962 and taken to the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth. However, in 1967, Edward was given release because of his exemplary behavior. In his memoir, he gave gratitude to a caring guard at Leavenworth for his personal development. Edward got married and followed his dream of becoming a motivational speaker after being freed. At 39 years old, he appeared on TV shows including What's My Line? And To Tell the Truth in 1972. His autobiography, The Metamorphosis of a Criminal, was released in the same year. At Edward's genuine life tale, Edward's luck appeared to be finally changing for the better. He was headed for success because he had figured out how to use the system. Regrettably, his fortuitous run was not long-lasting. In 1977, Edward killed his first victim, Billy Law, age 21, and his girlfriend, Judith Straub, age 18, both of Sterling, Ohio. On August 7, 1977, the couple went on a date, but they never came back. Their shoes and purse were left behind when Judith's automobile was found later that day in the Silver Creek Metro Park parking lot. The day after the event, August 8th, Norton police launched a search for Billy and Judith with the help of family members and a National Guard helicopter. Eventually, the search team found their bodies hidden in the thick undergrowth next to Metro Park. It was clear that a 20-gauge shotgun had been used to shoot them mercilessly at close range. Edward was able to avoid justice for the killings at that time because detectives were unable to link his case to those of Billy and Judith. But these murders also created a pattern that would hold true for Tim and Kelly's later kills. In the meantime, Edward was detained in Pennsylvania once more by 1982, this time for arson at the age of 49. Still, he was proud of his illicit accomplishments. Edward wrote a letter to the FBI in 1993 asking for his criminal and past records from 19 different locales. These tapes were allegedly meant to be part of a new book he was writing on the criminals he had come into contact with while incarcerated, people like Jimmy Hoffa, Tony Provenzano, and Charles Manson. At the age of 63, Edward killed 3 people in 1996. This time, the victim was Danny Boy Edwards, a 25-year-old foster son who had lived with him for 7 years in Burton, Ohio. Danny Boy had been a U.S. Army soldier before his untimely death. In some way, Edward was able to convince him to turn against the Army and go home. Edward cruelly killed Danny Boy with 2 gunshots to the face after tricking him into going into the neighboring woods. After that, Edward heartlessly dumped Danny Boy's body in a shallow hole, where it was later found by a hunter who immediately informed the police. Like with these first few killings, Edward spent a few years avoiding justice for killing Danny Boyle. Those who knew Edward well, like his daughter April and son John, characterized him as a very disturbed person. His severe abuse of his wife and kids caused them to run away from home as soon as they could in order to get away from his suffering. Investigators were adamant that Edward matched the archetypal serial killer in every way. His lengthy criminal past, his physical abuse of family members, and the fact that he chronicled his crimes in a book all suggested that he was a narcissist. Edward was able to tie the knots on the ropes that were thought to have been used to strangle Kelly because of his military experience. His history of arson contributed to the impression that he was a very domineering person. His Louisville, Kentucky neighbors were ignorant of the evil mind that lurked within him, despite his senior look and dependence on a wheelchair and oxygen tank due to his weight. Investigators now have a stronger reason to believe Edward was involved in the killings, though, thanks to fresh evidence in April's comments. When Edward first showed up at his Louisville house, he claimed not to have known about Tim Hack and Kelly Drew's killings. However, he acknowledged seeing the couple and being at the Concord house the night of the killings when pressed further. In addition, he acknowledged that, unlike his earlier assertions, he had not been deer hunting that evening. A salivar swab for DNA testing was approved by Edward, who was optimistic that the results would be exonerating. Still, the results of the DNA test matched the material discovered on Kelly's trousers. When Edward moved into a caravan park in Louisville in February 2009, his neighbors got along well with him and didn't know about his troubled past. His actual nature wasn't made public until he was transported to Wisconsin and accused of killing Kelly Drew and Tim Hack. The findings of the DNA test were shown to Edward during the interrogation, further linking him to the crimes. His bodily fluids were found on Kelly's clothing, and investigators asked him to explain them. Edward stammered and made up a story about having a sexual experience with Kelly on August 9, 1980, saying it was consensual. With frenzied gestures, he shifted about in his chair. He sighed and muttered something under his breath, sensing the skepticism of the investigators. Investigators listened to the taped interview several times and remembered the exact moment when Edward whispered, "Danette, I killed her." His fate was sealed with this revelation. Edward chose to enter a guilty plea for the killings of Kelly Drew and Tim Hawk. Edward Wayne Edwards was given 2 consecutive life sentences in April 2010 after being convicted guilty of the 1980 Sweetheart killings. Wisconsin did not have the capital penalty, notwithstanding his plea to be put to death. Phil Waters, a retired homicide detective, pointed out that Edward had prior jail time and was aware of the harsh realities of life behind bars. Not one to spend his days in prison, Edward wrote to the Ohio prosecutor's office, threatening to have a needle put in his arm in an attempt to get them to pursue the death sentence. Edward admitted to the 1977 murders of Judith Straub and Billy Ervico in 2010. However, he was given life sentences for each because the death penalty was not in effect at the time. Still, he had one last revelation to share. In February 2011, Edward acknowledged killing Danny Boy Edwards, his foster son, in order to get the life insurance money during an interview in a jailhouse. His plan worked this time, and on March 8, 2011, he was given the death penalty for the murder of Danny Boy Edward. Investigators surmised that Edward may have had 9 to 15 unidentified victims despite his conviction for 5 murders. Detective Chad Garcia from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, one of the investigators in the Sweetheart murders, also suggested that Edward might have been responsible for 15 other murders, including the Zodiac killings. In the book The Peyton Allen Files, Phil Stanford made the suggestion that Edward might have been responsible for the 1960 murders of Beverly Allen and Larry Peyton in Portland, Oregon. Although these allegations are still unsubstantiated, retired murder detective John Cameron expressed the opinion that Edward was responsible for the Zodiac killings and other well-known unsolved crimes. At the age of 77, Edward Edwards passed away from natural causes on April 7, 2011 at the Corrections Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. With his passing, a horrific crime spree that claimed 5 lives and left many more injured came to an end. Edward escaped the August 31, 2011 scheduled execution by lethal injection. The family members of Tim and Kelly did not find comfort in Edward's arrest for their deaths. Kelly's mother, Norma Walker, said that rather than offering closure, Edward's arrest brought back unpleasant memories. David Pym, Pym's father, was relieved that the ordeal was finally ended and expressed gratitude for the DNA evidence linking Edward to the murder. April Bellagio, the daughter of Edward, contributed to the resolution of the cold case and now uses her podcast, The Clearing, to help families of victims whose cases remain unsolved. Kelly Drew and Tim Hack have bright futures ahead of them. However, Edward Wayne Edwards, their killer, brutally ended their life. The serial killer Edward did not harbor any personal grudges against the pair. Their narrative is all the more tragic for having been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The families of Kelly Drew and Tim Hack, as well as the other victims, were still dealing with the fallout from the tragedy even after Edward Wayne Edward was arrested and the prosecutions were concluded. The pain caused by Edward's actions persisted, despite the fact that his conviction brought some closure. On July 4, 1965, Mary Cowan, a 39-year-old homemaker, went out drinking and dancing with her spouse, Dr. Madison Cowan III, a professor of hematology at the Kentucky Medical Center. Sam and Betty Struther, who were pals, were also with them. In true American fashion, the group celebrated Independence Day by heading to the members-only Idle Hour Country Club. In 1965, their drink expenditure of more over $40 amounted to much than $300 in alcohol alone. Sam Struther would subsequently estimate that the 4 people in the gathering drank 10 beers apiece. Following their night of dancing and mingling at the club, the elites went back to the Struther residence, which was 3 streets away from the K-Win residence. Mary complained of being sick, so Sam Struther, the husband of one of her friends, drove her home. The couple's 2 kids and the Struthers' kid were staying at the K-Win residence. After arriving home, a taxi was summoned to return the babysitter to her apartment at 12:30. But because of a misplacement, it took over an hour for the taxi to show up while he had a beer and stayed downstairs with the babysitter. He indicated that he left at roughly 1:30 a.m., leaving the door unlocked until after the babysitter was picked up. He said Mary never returned downstairs. Back at the still divorcing Struther residence, Dr. Madison Kahn and Sam kept drinking and mingling until around 3 in the morning when Dr. Kahn declared himself too drunk to go home by himself and made the decision to stay the night, which was not unusual for him to do. Betty picked up her child and the K-Win children the following morning and drove them back to her own house to prepare them breakfast after hearing from her own child that they hadn't had any food yet. She later took them to a neighboring swimming class. Betty returned to the Cowan residence after leaving the kids off and calling and phoning Mary again without success. She discovered Mary was still in her bedroom, sitting rigidly in a dark chair with her head cocked to one side. The room was unoccupied, and her bed remained made. Betty figured she had dozed off. When Betty looked more closely, she saw that Mary had passed away, not just from a bad hangover, but from a serious illness. Alone and terrified, Betty contacted both Sam Struther, Mary's husband, and Dr. Kwan, Mary's husband, and they both came right away. Sam Kwan was given the task of throwing away Mary's drink, which was on the bedside table, as soon as Dr. Kwan declared that Mary had killed herself. Upon confirming her death, they phoned one of Dr. Kean's medical pals rather than the police or an ambulance. It took until the crime scene was sufficiently tainted before police were summoned. The coroner needed 6 weeks to declare her death to be a homicide. It wasn't until the later autopsy that it was discovered she had been stabbed twice with a needle of some kind carrying an unidentified solution that the 2 needle marks on her thigh became visible. The cause of death was determined by autopsy to be carbolic acid poisoning. The CDC states that carbolic acid can result in the following symptoms: nausea, heavy perspiration, headache, dizziness, ringing in the ears, seizures, coma, respiratory depression, and death. Mary had blood alcohol content just below the fatal threshold of 0.4%. Her alcohol use may have made her already extremely vulnerable to attack, making it possible for her killer to give her the 2 injections of what the police thought to be a sedative. The extravagant means of taking a life, the drink spiking or other oral ingestion technique, the 2 puncture wounds, and the blood alcohol content all looked like they were taken straight out of a Hollywood film. And as everyone who has watched a movie knows, the husband is usually the main suspect. The pair was not at all pleased in their marriage despite the urge of Mary's father, the well-known George Swinboard, the dean of Kentucky's thoroughbred auctioneers, and the man who sold many of the future winners of the Kentucky Derby. The purportedly grieving spouse, Dr. Madison Cowan, was anything but a faithful man. Mary had received a divorce request from Dr. Cowan, but the divorce process had not yet started. Aside from his own wife, he was seeing 2 other ladies. He first had an affair with a colleague hospital hematologist, Dr. Emma J. Lepet, a divorcee. This would start a lengthy romance that had been going on for more than 2 years when Mary passed away. Subsequently, Dr. Kean started dating Barbara Liepman, who was a colleague's wife in addition to being one of his patients. Suffering from Hodgkin's cancer, Barbara Liepman appeared to be Dr. Madison's go-to-woman following the breakup with Dr. Lupet. Regarding Barbara Liepman, the philandering physician subsequently admitted to law enforcement that, quote, he was in love with her. But Barbara Liepman's husband was not in such a playful mood, and he threatened to hurt the man who was seeing his wife physically. Mary Cowan knew about the affair and was concerned about how it might affect her husband's reputation as well as his distinguished family. Given that his second affair included a patient, his medical license was in jeopardy. To further complicate things, Barbara, the patient who later became a lover, was expecting a child and wanted an abortion from Dr. Madison. She told the police that she was concerned the abortion wouldn't take place after Mary died, though it's unclear if she thought her boyfriend or husband was the father. Naturally, Barbara's husband, Dr. Littman, would be the second physician to be charged with murder if word of this affair spread. However, there existed a third possibility, which upon closer examination would seem to be the most malevolent of all. Dr. Lappet, the other lady, was reported to be extremely domineering. She would drive by Dr. Madison Kean's house and phone his office a lot in an attempt to stay in touch. She even had the ability to inform his secretary that she was under no obligation to forward any calls from Mrs. Littman to Dr. Kean. Littman was unhappy enough with Dr. Lupet's fixation on him that he was altering his exit strategy from the office and hanging his coat in different locations so that Dr. Lightman could keep an eye on him. Dr. Lightman often called Dr. Lightman, Barbara's husband, incoherently informing him of his wife's extramarital affair, albeit she did not disclose the identity of the other party. These calls were strange and invasive, inquiring about Barbara's background at random. Yet the most peculiar call came in between 2 and 3 in the morning on July 5th. Reportedly from Dr. Lightman's wife, this call, which was answered by a phone receptionist, stated that he was needed at home. By this point, Dr. Lightman was aware of the calls and had a suspicion that the woman who had been questioning him so much about Barbara was the one who was calling, not his wife, and that the call was a place to make him go home and discover his wife cheating. At this point, Dr. Lightman was aware that Dr. Kean was the one conducting an extramarital affair. Dr. Lightman, infuriated by the continuous calls at all hours, called the police. However, since he was unable to identify the caller and no crime had occurred, the police were unable to address the issue as it was merely a phone call. However, months after the first murder, Barbara Lehman received test results from the hospital related to her Hodgkin's cancer. The results were given to Dr. Lupet, a fellow hematologist, while Dr. Kean was not on duty. Dr. Lupet concluded that giving Barbara Lightman nitrogen mustard would be the best course of action. A chemical included by Schedule 1 of the Chemical Weapons Convention is nitrogen mustard. Lightman said that Dr. Lupet wasn't her doctor and that she wouldn't accept treatment until Dr. Kean returned to duty. Nitrogen mustard is a potent medicine. After Mary's sudden death, Dr. Kwan continued to meet Barbara and displayed odd behavior. 5 days after Mary's daughter passed away, he informed her that the pathologist believed her daughter had simply consumed too many Alka-Seltzers, causing gas to build up in the system and seemingly causing a heart attack, which, given that the pathology and mortuary departments had not yet determined the cause of death, was a strange remark to make. With no additional leads or witnesses, the police were left to speculate as to who might be trying to tie up loose ends: the philandering husband, Dr. Kean, the jealous ex-affair, Dr. Lupet, or the resentful husband, Dr. Lightman. When a writer interviewed Dr. Lupet years later, she said that she had never even met Dr. Kean. There has never been a murderer apprehended, and Mary's case is classified as a permafrost cold case. Dorene Erbert. Dorene Erbert, born on November 29, 1952, in California, came from a large family with 5 children. She was known for her kindness, positivity, and her desire to help others. This desire led her to pursue a career in physiotherapy after college. Moving to San Francisco, Dorene began working in her chosen field, but she also had a dream of building her own large family. At the age of 24, Dorene met Michael Dennis, a man who would later become her husband. The couple quickly connected, sharing similar values and aspirations, and soon they were married. Together, they started their own family, a dream Dorene had long cherished. However, their life took an unimaginable turn on Halloween night, when a simple evening at home would lead to a horrifying and tragic event. Michael Dennis worked at a factory near Dorene's clinic, and their relationship quickly blossomed, leading to marriage. In 1976, they welcomed their son, Paul, into the world. However, as time passed, the joy of parenthood began to strain their marriage. Within a year of Paul's birth, Dorene and Michael made the difficult decision to divorce. Their son, Paul, stayed with Dorene, but Michael maintained a regular presence in his life through visits. Despite the divorce, Dorene and Michael kept their relationship amicable, and she continued to move forward with her life. A year later, Dorene met a man named Charles, and they began dating. The couple soon married and moved to San Jose, where they settled in a peaceful residential neighborhood. In 1979, Dorene and Charles welcomed a daughter, Diana, further fulfilling their dream of a growing family. Like Dorene, Charles also envisioned a large, happy family, and their new life seemed promising. But little did they know, their world would soon be turned upside down by a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Charles embraced Dorene's son, Paul, as his own, and the arrival of their daughter, Diana, brought them immense joy. However, in February of 1980, their world shattered when tragedy struck. Paul, just 4 years old, climbed over the fence surrounding their pool and fell into the water. Dorene, who was at home at the time, noticed too late. She rushed to pull her son from the pool and called for an ambulance. Paul was quickly transported to the hospital, where doctors connected him to a life support machine. Despite their best efforts, after 10 agonizing days, the doctors concluded that there was no chance of survival. The decision was made to disconnect him from life support. Dorene, utterly devastated, could not stop blaming herself for the accident, even though the police investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing. The loss of her son tore her apart, and she was left with a deep, unshakable sense of grief and guilt. Despite the lingering sadness from the loss of her son, Dorene found solace in her daughter Diana, who helped her through the grief. For years after the tragedy, there was finally a glimmer of hope for the family. Dorene and Charles had been trying for years to have another child, but 2 pregnancies had ended in miscarriage. However, this time, Dorene's pregnancy progressed well, and the couple eagerly awaited the arrival of a baby boy, due in early November. As Halloween approached, the family decided to participate in the festive activities. The neighborhood was alive with decorations, children running from house to house, and families enjoying the spirit of the season. Diana, now 4 years old, was especially excited about trick-or-treating. Despite being 9 months pregnant, Dorene couldn't say no to her daughter's enthusiasm and joined her for a night of Halloween fun. Charles stayed home, passing out candy to the neighborhood kids. Mother and daughter returned home shortly before 9 p.m., full of laughter and candy bags in hand. Little did they know, their evening would take a shocking and horrifying turn. Charles told his wife that they were running low on candy, so he planned to head to the nearest store to restock, not wanting to disappoint the neighborhood children. He left the house at around 8:50 p.m. and returned 15 minutes later. As he approached the house, he noticed the front door was slightly open, which seemed unusual. What he found inside, however, was a true nightmare. Upon entering, he saw his wife lying on the floor in the hallway, surrounded by a large amount of blood. Dorene appeared lifeless, prompting Charles to immediately call 911. As he moved further into the house, he found the body of their unborn child in the living room. In shock and disbelief, he struggled to process what he was seeing. At one point, he briefly wondered if Dorene had suffered a miscarriage, but he soon realized the situation was far worse. Next to the child, he saw a human hand. Charles immediately realized the hand belonged to Dorene. Understanding that someone had attacked his family, he began searching for his daughter, fearing she might also be in danger. The house was covered in blood, and in his frantic search, Charles even slipped and fell while rushing through the rooms. Thankfully, he found his daughter alive, hiding behind the sofa in the living room. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics detected a faint pulse in Dorene and quickly rushed her to the hospital. Sadly, they were unable to save her, and she passed away en route. The unborn child also did not survive. In addition to being removed from Dorene's womb, the baby had suffered multiple blows. Medical experts later determined that Dorene had been repeatedly struck with a long, sharp object, possibly a sword or machete. Meanwhile, the police investigated the house, which resembled a scene from a horrific horror movie. Later, several officers sought psychological help, as even they couldn't cope with what they had witnessed. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, walls, and even the ceiling. Investigators examined the entire house but didn't find the perpetrator or any clues. Outside the house, police saw bloody footprints on the sidewalk. They stopped in the middle of the road, leading investigators to believe the killer had gotten into a car at that spot. Soon, as Charles stated, they never owned such a mask. The evidence was sent to the laboratory, and police tried to talk to Diana. The girl was in complete shock, but she was the sole witness to what happened, and potentially could help identify the assailant. Diana told them that shortly after her father left for the store, someone knocked on their door. Dorene went to answer, and saw a man in a wolf mask holding a long blade. He told her, "I'm going to kill you now." After that, the woman screamed at her daughter to run out of the house, and the girl hid behind the sofa. Diana couldn't recall what happened next to the moment when her father found her. She also couldn't help the police identify the attacker, as he was wearing a wolf mask. Initially, investigators considered the victim's husband as a suspect. They found it suspicious how his trip to the store coincided with the arrival of the killer, as Dorene was attacked just minutes after her husband left home. When Charles returned, he stepped on blood multiple times, even falling and getting covered in it. Police didn't rule out the possibility that he might have done this intentionally to have an excuse for the blood on his clothes. However, detectives quickly found several inconsistencies in this theory. Firstly, Charles's shoes clearly didn't match those that left bloody footprints on the street. Secondly, the killer likely got into a car parked on the road in front of the house. But there were no blood traces found in Charles's vehicle, nor a different pair of shoes. Police went to the store Charles visited and spoke to the staff member. He confirmed that Charles did buy candies from him that evening, indicating he didn't have time to commit the murder. Surveillance footage from the store also supported this alibi, so detectives temporarily stopped considering him the prime suspect and asked Charles if he had anyone in mind who might wish harm to his family. And the men immediately pointed to Dorene's ex-husband, Michael. According to Charles initially, Michael maintained a normal relationship with his ex-wife. But everything changed after the death of their son, who drowned in the pool. Michael blamed Dorene. Believing she deliberately killed the boy to cut all connections, he even filed a civil lawsuit against her, seeking to hold her responsible for the child's death, but lost the case. Even during the time when Michael and Dorene were still married, he occasionally behaved quite strangely. After the birth of their son, he often fell into depression, distancing himself from both his wife and child. Dorene believed all of this somehow connected to his childhood traumas. Michael had hearing problems from an early age, requiring him to constantly wear a bulky hearing aid. In those days, it was a rather large device, and because of it, other children constantly teased Michael. All of this led to the man growing up introverted, practically having no friends, and avoiding interaction with women. Despite seemingly leaving these issues behind after meeting Dorene, Michael couldn't shake off his old problems completely. This became one of the main reasons for the couple's decision to divorce. When Dorene married Charles, Michael began harboring resentment and animosity towards her, especially disliking the fact that another man was raising his son. These feelings intensified after Paul's death, and he started genuinely hating his ex-wife. Michael also lost his job where he had spent most of his adult life. This factor also had some negative effect on him. After hearing all of this, the detectives decided to go to the man's house and talk to him. Charles's account was clearly insufficient to make Michael the prime suspect, but since he lived only 2 miles from Dorene's house, they decided to pay him a visit right away. Officers arrived at his home around midnight and saw the pickup truck parked near the garage. They shined a flashlight inside and saw something resembling blood on the steering wheel and keys. Afterward, they knocked on the door, but nobody answered. The lights were on, and officers could hear water running inside the house, leading them to suspect that the man might be disposing of evidence or cleaning blood-stained clothes. So they continued knocking. Michael eventually opened the door. He remained calm, even after being informed about his ex-wife's murder. The man answered all their questions nonchalantly and allowed the officers inside without a warrant. According to him, he went to the store during the day, returned home, and hadn't left since. Michael even agreed to sign voluntary consent papers to allow a search of his house. As he reached for the pen to sign, investigators noticed a deep cut on his right hand. Michael claimed he accidentally cut himself earlier while carving a pumpkin for Halloween. However, the police doubted his words. The wound was visibly fresh, and blood was still oozing from it. Meanwhile, a few officers started searching his house. Michael went upstairs with one of them since they asked him to show his ID. When they entered his bedroom, Michael reached for the bed headboard, but the officer immediately told him to step aside. His actions seemed suspicious. Why would he keep his documents behind the bed? When the officer approached, he saw a holster hanging on the bed headboard with a loaded gun inside. He took the weapon and led Michael downstairs to the other officers. Meanwhile, his colleagues discovered blood droplets on the floor, leading them to a washing machine in the garage and a pile of clothes with blood stains. This was sufficient for an arrest, and they took the man into custody. Afterward, detectives, along with forensic experts, scrutinized the house more thoroughly, seeking evidence that might link Michael to the murder. The analysis of the blood would take a few days, and meanwhile the police found some new gruesome discoveries. At first, they uncovered an empty box for a machete with an 18-inch blade. Medical experts confirmed that this model perfectly matched the wounds on Dorene's body. Secondly, Michael had 2 makeshift coffins in his house, leading detectives to suspect they were intended for Dorene and her husband. Additionally, the police found body bags typically used by medical staff. Considering Michael had no association with these items, it raised significant concerns. Putting all these pieces together, the police went to the judge to request a warrant for the suspect's arrest for an extended period. Without it, they could only detain him for a limited time. However, the judge deemed the evidence too circumstantial. As a result, Michael had to be released, and the man walked free. Nevertheless, 3 days later, the detectives got the answer from the lab. Experts found 2 types of blood at the crime scene, belonging to different individuals. Blood type analysis revealed that the majority of it shared the same blood type as Dorene, with a small amount matching Michael's. Apparently, the man injured himself during the attack on his ex-wife. This time, the judge promptly issued an arrest warrant, and Michael was officially charged with the murder of his ex-wife and her unborn child. Soon, detectives found another piece of evidence linking him to the crime. Speaking with Michael's acquaintances, they learned he owned the exact same wolf mask found near Dorene's house. On the previous Halloween, he wore it to a party, and police even discovered a photo of Michael wearing the mask. To eliminate any doubts, they found in his home the exact clothing he wore in that photo. But the story of the mask didn't end there. To further strengthen the case, police interviewed all of Dorene's neighbors about that evening. It turned out that children going door to door for candy saw an adult man wearing a wolf mask standing across the street from the victim's house, staring at it. Notably, they spotted him around 7 p.m., 2 hours before the murder. Michael's trial began in July 1988, 4 years after the murder. Initially, he pleaded guilty, but later changed his plea. He didn't deny committing the murder, but claimed innocence due to mental health issues. A psychologist assigned to him concluded that he indeed had serious mental problems. Michael told him that he snapped because of Halloween. Witnessing other kids joyfully trick-or-treating reminded him of Paul's death, triggering his breakdown. According to Michael, he went to Dorene's house with a machete on that evening. When she opened the door, he said, "You killed my son," and added that he intended to murder her. She immediately recognized the man behind the mask, screamed for her daughter to run, and in the second, Michael attacked her. He insisted that he was unaware of Dorene's pregnancy, a claim that seemed hard to believe. Standing at just 4 feet tall, all her friends insisted it was impossible not to notice her pregnancy. Before the tragedy, they even joked that because of her belly, Dorene had become broader than taller. The prosecution argued that the man was fully aware of his actions and had planned the crime in advance. During the investigation, detectives discovered he had told friends about his desire to kill his ex-wife and her husband, then dispose of their bodies in the bay. Given that they found 2 coffins and body bags in his home, the prosecution suggested he intended to carry out this plan, but changed his mind for some reason. Perhaps he panicked or feared staying in the house too long, thinking he might get caught. Dorene's daughter, Diana, also gave testimony during the trial. At the time, she was 9 years old and still had a vivid recollection of the events. Though Charles wanted to shield his daughter from the trauma, she was the only person who had witnessed the crime. The trial lasted for a year, and in the end, Michael was found guilty of murdering both Dorene and her child. He was sentenced to death, but while awaiting execution, California implemented a moratorium on the death penalty. As a result, Michael remains incarcerated to this day, with little chance of his sentence being carried out anytime soon. Many years later, Diana shared that the memory of the murder haunted her throughout her life, constantly reminding her of the horrific events. Eventually, she chose to forgive Michael and try to move forward, fearing that holding on to the pain would lead her to lose her sanity. Laurel Jean Mitchell. Laurel Jean Mitchell was born on May 24, 1958, in Whitley County, Indiana, to parents Richard and Wilma Mitchell. She grew up in North Webster, Indiana, alongside her siblings, Sarah and Bruce. At the time, North Webster had a population of around 500 and was considered a very safe community. It was a place where residents rarely locked their doors. Parents felt comfortable letting their children ride bikes freely around the traffic-free streets, and neighbors often spent hours socializing on their front porches. By 1975, Laurel, a 17-year-old senior at Wawasee High School, worked at Cokesbury and in the Epworth Forest neighborhood, situated on the shores of Webster Lake. For her, the job offered a perfect chance to gain valuable experience while earning some extra money. Laurel approached everything with determination and enthusiasm, fully investing herself in the role. Laurel Mitchell quickly became a favorite among both the staff and the customers at Cokesbury Inn. She was actively involved in her local church youth group and was also a member of a traveling singing group called God's Children. The group toured across the United States, recording music and releasing a couple of albums. Laurel was deeply religious, with her faith playing a central role in her life. Most of her free time was spent at church, and although she had the occasional disagreement with her siblings, she shared a strong and close-knit bond with them that only grew as time went on. Laurel was adored in her community, where her warm smile and kind demeanor won over everyone she met. One of her most cherished traits was her genuine kindness and caring nature, which made her particularly beloved by the neighborhood children. It was common to see Laurel surrounded by children, all eager to be in her company. She had a variety of talents, with a natural gift for singing that made her an integral part of the local church choir. Laurel was also a skilled dancer, having taken lessons at a local studio to perfect her craft. For her, singing and dancing were more than just pastimes. They were an essential part of her life. On the afternoon of August 6, 1975, the day began just like any other. Laurel and her siblings completed their morning chores, and Laurel left for work around 2 p.m. Her 12-year-old sister, Sarah, stayed home that day. Laurel's brother Bruce was married and stationed in California with the Army at the time, and one of her friends from Michigan was staying with the family. After finishing her shift at the snack bar around 10 p.m., Laurel was headed to meet friends at Adventureland Amusement Park, which was about a half-mile walk away. A co-worker offered her a ride, but Laurel declined, choosing to walk instead. She was last seen walking toward the amusement park on the north side of North Webster. A family friend, Scott Pruitt, spotted her as she passed by the pillars marking the entrance to Epworth Forest. He waved at her, and she waved back before continuing past the pillars. That was the final confirmed sighting of Laurel Mitchell. Laurel never showed up to meet her friends at the amusement park, as they had decided to go to the county fair instead, which included the friend from Michigan. As a result, no one realized Laurel was missing until she didn't come home by midnight. Known for being responsible, Laurel would always call her parents if she were going to be late. When she still hadn't returned home by curfew, her family became worried. The situation became even clearer when the friend from Michigan arrived at the Mitchell home and asked, "Where is Laurel?" The friends thought she had gone home, and her family assumed she was with her friends. This misunderstanding led Laurel's parents, Richard and Wilma Mitchell, to report her as a missing person at 4:16 a.m. the following morning. The dispatcher took their information and assured them that a unit would be sent out to take the report. An extensive search was immediately launched by the police, as well as by Richard Mitchell, family members, and friends of Laurel. Richard himself walked the ditches along the road, worried that she might have been struck by a car and thrown into the side. Concerned neighbors and friends gathered to comb through the woods and check the roadsides, hoping to find any sign of Laurel. Investigators quickly concluded that Laurel never made it to Adventureland, suggesting that something must have happened to her on the way there. A few hours after she was reported missing, at around 10:30 a.m., a fisherman named Glenn Dixon and his son discovered a woman's body in the Elkhart River at the Mallard Bruce Public Access Site on Noble County Road 600 North, just west of 400 West. They immediately called 911, waded into the water to retrieve the body, which was found face down on the west bank of the river near the boat landing ramp. The body was floating in about waist-deep water. State police initially could not identify the woman, but they estimated that the body had been in the water for about a day. They checked missing persons reports in the area that matched the victim's description. The woman was described as being 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing about 160 pounds, with long brown hair. After further investigation, police identified her as Laurel Mitchell, based on a class ring from Lossie High School, class of 1976, which was found on her. Her initials, LJM, were engraved inside the ring. At first, investigators believed the death might have been an accidental drowning, especially considering Laurel's reputation as a strong swimmer. However, this theory changed once the autopsy report came back. The autopsy was conducted later that same day, on August 7, 1975, by Dr. Peel Sankey at Goshing General Hospital. The autopsy report revealed that Laurel had been forcibly drowned and signs of assault were present. It also showed evidence that she had fought violently to survive. The police speculated that much of the evidence had been washed away by the water, as only a small bruise was found on her hand and a few abrasions under her arms. When the police arrived at Laurel's parents' home, Richard and Wilma were anxiously waiting for news about their daughter. They were not prepared for the devastating information the officers brought. As they learned the tragic fate of their daughter, Richard's eyes filled with tears, and Wilma was left inconsolable. Laurel's funeral became a poignant moment for the community of North Webster, as it highlighted the close-knit bond among the residents. The funeral home was overwhelmed with flowers, and the outpouring of support from the community was so great that there was no more room for the people who came to mourn her. The funeral for Laurel Mitchell drew an overwhelming crowd of well-wishers, friends, and family members who wanted to pay their respects. Due to the sheer number of people, the service had to be moved to the church. Laurel's sister, Sarah, recalled, "I don't remember the sermon at all. I just remember sitting between my dad and my brother, and they were both squeezing my hand so hard. As they left the church, they were met with the sight of people lined up down the street, many of whom couldn't fit inside the church." After the funeral, the investigation into Laurel's tragic death intensified, with detectives from various state and local agencies working tirelessly. They scoured through evidence and conducted numerous interviews. On August 9, 1975, a crucial call was received at 3:15 p.m. The caller had important information but abruptly hung up before they could provide full details or reveal their identity. This mysterious call further complicated the investigation, leaving more questions than answers. Investigators made an appeal for the person to contact them again, and they would do their best to keep her identity private. Police set up a headquarters for the continuing investigation in North Webster. One local witness, identified as Catherine Flynn, said around 10 p.m. that night, she heard a loud car turn around next door. She said she heard voices say, "Let's get her." Investigators interviewed Catherine, who lived half a mile east of Epworth Forest on Epworth Forest Road. She said she was home on Wednesday, August 6, 1975, and that around 10 p.m. or a little later, an old car turned into the drive next door and turned around as it came back by her house. She informed investigators that she heard several voices say, "Let's get her." She said the car was very loud and probably a dark color. Another local, Frank Overmeyer, told investigators he also heard a loud vehicle in the neighborhood, possibly an Oldsmobile Cutlass. They went to interview Frank Overmeyer and his wife on August 14, 1975. The Overmeyers lived on Epworth Forest Road, just west of Epworth Forest. Frank Overmeyer said on August 6, 1975, he was at home watching TV and heard a loud car go by, and the car turned around and stopped east of their house. Frank reported he then heard what he thought sounded like someone slamming the trunk on a car. Frank reported he turned on his porch light and stepped outside. When he stepped out, 2 cars were leaving the area. The first car was the one that had gone by his house that he described was a red-orange GM product, possibly an Oldsmobile Cutlass. The second vehicle was a medium green Mustang. The Oldsmobile was very loud and sounded like it was loud by design. All of the clothing and belongings found on Laurel's body were collected and preserved for DNA testing, including shoes, a sweatshirt, bra, underwear, and denim jeans. Unfortunately, due to the lack of DNA technology at the time, there was little that could be done with the clothing. Detectives from the Kosciuszko County Sheriff's Department and Indiana State Police examined the case closely through the years. The location of Laurel's abduction and the discovery of her body in the Elkhart River about 15 miles from Epworth Forest seemed to indicate that the perpetrator was familiar with the area. Many people were interviewed, and despite being a $5,000 reward offered, there was never enough evidence to charge anyone. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case slowly faded from the headlines and went cold. For Laurel's family and friends, the pain of her loss remained. In February 2007, Indiana State Police Captain Kevin Smith was assigned as the lead investigator on Laurel's case. He was a man on a mission and was determined to provide answers that had eluded Laurel's family for so long. The pressure was on, but Captain Smith knew that he would do whatever it takes to give Laurel's loved ones the closure they deserved. Despite his best efforts, no new leads or evidence surfaced for several years, leaving him and his team frustrated. Then, on January 16, 2012, Laurel's father, Richard Mitchell, passed away. He was a well-known public figure in North Webster. Laurel's mother, Wilma Mitchell, also passed away in February 2012. She operated the North Webster Food Pantry for several years. They passed never knowing what exactly happened to their 17-year-old daughter or why. It was a heartbreaking end for a couple who had dedicated their lives to seeking answers and closure for their daughter. In February 2013, a woman called Renee from Port Charlotte, Florida came forward and gave investigators a lot of useful information. Detective Dunafin interviewed Renee on June 7, 2013. She informed the detective that she lived in Noble County as a teenager and that she was 16 years old in 1975. She went on a date with a man named John Wayne Lehman, and while on the date, they went to a party. After the party, John Wayne Lehman was driving her home when Lehman admitted his involvement in a crime that he committed with his friend. Fred Bandy Jr. Lehman provided details of the crime to Renee that are consistent with the findings made by police where Laurel's body was found and the anatomical findings made by Dr. Sankey during the autopsy of her body. On July 3, 2014, investigators interviewed Bill McDonald at the Ligonier Police Department. Bill indicated that back in 1975, he was a sophomore at West Noble High School and that he socialized with a man named Fred Bandy Jr. Bill told investigators that Bandy told him that he had committed the crime that took place at Mallard's Roost, which was a public access site adjacent to the location where Laurel's body was found. Also in February 2014, Captain Kevin Smith received information about a local music group that performed in Epworth Forest the night of August 6, 1975. They were identified as the Celebrate the Sun group. This generated renewed interest in the case. Unfortunately, it did not lead anywhere. Captain Smith said, "I feel pretty confident after speaking with someone from that group. I don't believe they have information that will help." On September 25, 2019, Noble County Sheriff's Department Detective Joe Hutzel met with Rick Johnson to interview him about the Laurel Mitchell case. Rick Johnson informed Detective Hutzel that he was friends with Bill McDonald and that while he was in high school, he, Bill McDonald, Fred Bandy, John Wayne Lehman, and others were at a party together. While at the party, a conversation about the slaying of Laurel Mitchell came up, and Fred Bandy Jr. stated he and John Wayne Lehman committed that crime together. Investigators needed more than just reports from witnesses. They needed DNA evidence linking Bandy and Lehman to the crime. Advances had been made in cold cases in recent years due to new technology such as genetic genealogy, which involves putting a suspect or victim's DNA profile into a public database, allowing them to reverse engineer a family tree. This enables investigation of multiple branches of a family's tree to determine who could be a viable suspect in an unsolved case. Another recent advancement factoring into solving cold cases is the use of touch DNA samples. This method requires minuscule amounts of DNA, such as skin cells from the perpetrator that may be left on objects at a crime scene. A breakthrough enabling an accurate genotype from rootless hair is another technique now available. Until February 2019, forensic scientists were only able to extract DNA from hairs found at crime scenes if the root of the hair was attached. Unfortunately, most hairs do not have the root attached. This breakthrough in DNA extraction from rootless hair is extremely useful in solving crimes. Solving cold cases often involves a diligent and time-consuming re-examination of evidence from files and the efforts of experienced investigators. By February 2019, Laurel Mitchell's clothes and evidence were resubmitted for DNA testing. In February 2020, a certificate of analysis was generated by Indiana State Police Laboratory Division that showed a male DNA profile was developed from the clothing. After 3 suspects were eliminated as possibilities, attention shifted to Fred Bandy for a buccal swab. Bandy voluntarily provided the DNA sample on December 5, 2022 at his residence. On January 13, 2023, the state laboratory found that Fred Bandy Jr.'s buccal swab showed he is 13 billion times more likely contributor of the DNA on Laurel Mitchell's clothing than any other unknown person. A review of Indiana State Police records also disclosed that Bandy was driving a 1971 Oldsmobile at the time, which is consistent with eyewitness statements from area residents on that fateful night. Investigators concluded that Lehman and Bandy, with premeditated malice, used Bandy's Oldsmobile to bring Laurel to the Mallard Roost public access site in Noble County, where they forcibly removed her from the vehicle and deliberately drowned her. While the Indiana State Police declined to comment on the specific techniques used to solve the case, Ashley Hall, the director of the Forensic Science Graduate Program at the University of California, explained. She said the method seemed to be a standard genetic identification technology used in crime labs called STR or short tandem repeat. The technology is developing to become more and more sensitive. It is being developed to pick up smaller and smaller amounts of DNA. We can pick up much more DNA than we used to be able to. Laurel Mitchell's case is a good example of the power and evolution of DNA testing to assist in criminal investigations. Dr. Hull said, "We're not done with our work until every family, every victim has an answer. And the fact that we can go back to cases that are this old, this is where we should be going," she said. Captain Kevin Smith, who has been working the case for over 20 years, said this case is a culmination of a 5 decades-long investigation, and science finally gave us the answers we needed. Playing a significant role in charges being filed was the Indiana State Police Laboratory Division. We simply could not have solved this case without them. He also said that the investigation of the case had followed a similar pattern of other such cases. Witnesses pass away. Memories fade. All those hurdles make it very difficult, especially when you go back this far. On Monday, February 6, 2023, the Indiana State Police arrested 67-year-old John Wayne Lehman and 67-year-old Fred Bandy Jr. It was announced to the public that John Lehman and Bandy Jr., both 67-year-old residents of Indiana, have been identified as the suspects responsible for what happened to Laurel Jean Mitchell. Bandy lived in 1014 Fifth Street in Goshen, Indiana, and Lehman lived at 108 Clark Street in Auburn, Indiana. Both are being held without bond at the Noble County Jail. This is not the first time that Fred Bandy Jr. is in trouble with law. He is a twice convicted child abuser and deemed a violent predator. In February 2001, he pleaded guilty to child solicitation and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. In February 2016, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of child abuse and served nearly 6 years. During an initial hearing on February 8, 2023, Bandy and Lehman were informed by Noble Circuit Court Judge Michael Kramer they each face a charge of taking Laurel's life in the first degree. With current Indiana law, an individual convicted of such a charge faces a prison sentence between 45 and 65 years, with the advisory sentence being 55 years. However, since Laurel's slaying occurred in 1975, if the men are convicted, Bandy and Lehman could be sentenced to life in prison, which was the maximum possible prison sentence at that time. Also, during the initial hearing, a pretrial conference for both Bandy and Lehman was scheduled for 1:30 p.m. on April 24, 2023 in Noble County. Laurel's sister, Sarah, who was 12 years old back in 1975, recently did an interview with the New York Times after the arrests were made. She described their childhood in North Webster as typical before the horror visited her family. It was just a very small town, laid back. We felt safe, she said. We came and went as we pleased in the summer, and parents did not worry about us. She was a really good person. It's like, gosh, you picked somebody really good to do this to, somebody who could have done a lot of good in this world. I'm very glad they were finally arrested and very appreciative of the people who came forward. Sarah recalled how Captain Smith had carried around big books that detailed the names and addresses of everyone the authorities had interviewed over the years. There were over 1,000 names in there, she said. When Captain Smith called Sarah and her brother, Bruce Mitchell, to let them know they had arrested 2 men, she was surprised but mostly wished her parents had been alive to see it. 47 years had passed, but for Sarah Mitchell, the pain of that day remained as fresh as ever. Right now it feels like yesterday, she said. On that fateful night when Laurel didn't return home, 12-year-old Sarah had somehow slept through the uncertainty. When she awoke the next morning, she was more confused than concerned, unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. She had a softball game that day, and despite the growing tension at home, her parents encouraged her to go. As Sarah played, focused on the game, she didn't know that her world was about to change forever. Halfway through, a neighbor woman appeared at the ball field in the Mitchell family car. I saw her pull up to the ball diamond, Sarah recalled. Immediately, Sarah told her coach she had to leave. The neighbor told her that she had been sent to pick her up, though Sarah was still unaware of what was going on. As they neared home, the sight of police cars surrounding the house stopped her in her tracks. The neighbor's somber words cut through the air. They're here to look for your sister. Sarah's heart began to race. As they entered through the back door, she saw her father. Tears filled his eyes as he told her the unthinkable. Laurel was gone. Gone? Sarah asked, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of what he was saying. At just 12 years old, Sarah struggled to comprehend the devastating news. Gone where? She had wondered before her father finally broke the heartbreaking news. Her big sister Laurel, the one who always took care of her, as big sisters do, was gone. It was a realization that shook her to her core. Years later, when she saw the accused, Lehman and Bandy, in court, Sarah reflected on their appearances. At 12, they would have been scary. They look like very frail men, and I do not need to be afraid of them. Despite the eventual convictions of the men responsible for her sister's death, Sarah expressed that it did little to bring closure. I'm glad they are going to be punished, that they won't be able to hurt anyone else, but she's still not coming back to us. Convictions would not bring closure for me. I do not think there is such a thing. For Sarah, the grief remains ongoing, a burden that can't be erased by the judicial process or the passing of time. She, like her family, would continue to mourn Laurel, knowing that no punishment moving on to the next case. Shelley Connelly. In the quiet stretch of Seward Highway south of Anchorage, Alaska, a haunting discovery in 1978 marked the start of a long-standing mystery when the body of 16-year-old Shelley Connelly was found. The case eventually went cold, leaving her loved ones without answers, until 2019, when forensic technology finally unraveled the case. Raised in Anchorage, Shelley was an energetic and adventurous teenager with a strong bond to her family. Petite in stature, she was often described as having a natural beauty, though her mother later remarked that Shelley didn't quite realize how attractive she was. Although she dropped out of high school, Shelley was determined to forge her own path. With a passion for beauty and personal care, she was set to begin cosmetology classes. At just 16, she was also engaged to a man stationed at Fort Richardson in the military. January 7, 1978, began as any other day in Anchorage shrouded in thick fog, a day that would later be forever etched in the memories of those who knew Shelley. It was a day that Judy Connelly, Shelley's mother, would replay in her mind countless times over the years. That evening, Shelley had plans to go out. She chose an outfit that matched her bold personality. And despite her mother's concerns about her revealing clothing, Shelley slipped on a ski jacket her parents had gifted her for Christmas and headed to Chilkoot Charlie's, a popular Anchorage bar. Though underage, Shelley blended in with the crowd of young adults who frequented the bar. At the time, Chilkoot Charlie's was a hotspot, fueled by the oil boom that had brought a surge of young men with disposable incomes to the area. Later that night, Shelley was seen leaving the bar in the company of several men. Witnesses later reported spotting her at Lyra's, a 24-hour diner on C Street. However, the timeline of her movements started to become increasingly unclear. Sometime after leaving Lyra's, Shelley's night took a tragic turn. The following morning, two female hikers walking along the Seward Highway noticed something down an embankment near the train tracks. What they first mistook for discarded trash or debris turned out to be something much more disturbing. Lying motionless in the snow was the body of Shelley Connelly, her petite frame partially covered by the fresh snow. The hikers immediately notified the authorities, and soon Alaska State Troopers arrived on the scene. They quickly secured the area as investigators from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation joined them. The state medical examiner would later confirm that Shelley had been brutally assaulted and left to die in the frigid Alaskan winter. She had been beaten, and her body showed signs of a violent attack. In the end, a combination of internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen, and the exposure to the freezing temperatures ultimately took her life. Evidence suggested that after she was assaulted, Shelley had been thrown from a moving car. Her hand became trapped in the door, and the vehicle dragged her some distance before her assailants realized what had happened. When they stopped the car and freed her, they callously discarded her over the side of the embankment, deserting her in the cold of the night. There were faint marks in the snow signs that she had tried to crawl up after being thrown out of the vehicle. Initial efforts focused on piecing together the events leading up to Shelley's tragic demise. Troopers interviewed witnesses, including patrons of Chilkoot Charlie's and Leary's Diner, trying to trace her movements from the night before. Despite numerous interviews and efforts to reconstruct her last hours, the investigation hit a series of ends. The Alaska State Troopers quickly realized that the case would require more advanced forensic techniques. By 1997, with forensic DNA technology becoming a viable tool for solving cases, the Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory began developing a DNA profile from the biological evidence collected during Shelley's autopsy. This profile aimed to match the unidentified suspect's DNA with known profiles and codices. In February 2003, the DNA profile from Shelley's case was uploaded into codices. Even with this step forward in the right direction, there was no match found, and the investigation remained at a standstill. The case was reopened and evidence re-examined multiple times throughout the years, yielding no new leads. It was not until February 2019 that investigators finally got a break in the cold case. In early 2019, the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit turned to genetic genealogy for new insights. This innovative forensic technique involves submitting a DNA profile from the crime scene to Powerbond Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in DNA analysis and genealogy. Powerbond Nanolabs compared the DNA profile from Shelley's case to profiles in public genealogical databases, such as GEDmatch. They identified a man named Donald F. McQuaid as a person of interest based on genetic connections to the DNA profile. The results indicated that McQuaid, who was 21 years old at the time of Shelley's slaying, was a likely suspect. Following this identification, Alaska State Troopers conducted a thorough investigation to confirm the link. They obtained a DNA sample from McQuaid and compared it with the evidence collected from Shelley's autopsy. The match was conclusive. DNA samples collected from 2 locations on Shelley's body matched McQuaid's DNA profile. The breakthrough led to McQuaid's arrest in September 2019. It was a pivotal moment in the case, bringing renewed hope to Shelley Connelly's family and the community. Shelley's mother, Judy, said that she felt many emotions when she was told that her daughter's perpetrator was finally found. She said, happiness that they found him. Sad too. 41 years. So this was totally unexpected. The evidence against McQuaid was compelling. The DNA match firmly linked him to the crime scene, and further investigation verified that he had been in Alaska in 1978, aligning with the timeline of the slaying. The legal proceedings that followed were intensive. McQuaid faced charges of first-degree and second-degree. The case was handled by Assistant Attorneys General Aaron McCarthy and Paige Smothers, who worked tirelessly to build a strong case for the court. The prosecution emphasized the severity of the crime and the profound impact it had on Shelley's family, pushing for a sentence that would reflect both the seriousness of the offense and McQuaid's advanced age. On April 26, 2024, Superior Court Judge Andrew Peterson sentenced McQuaid to 50 years in prison for the murder of Shelley Connelly. In his remarks, Judge Peterson highlighted the gravity of the crime and the long-awaited justice for Shelley and her family. He pointed out that while McQuaid had lived a full life and witnessed his children grow up, Shelley's family had been robbed of those same years with her. The sentencing was an emotional moment for the Connelly family, who had spent over 4 decades waiting for closure. They felt a mix of relief and sorrow, knowing that while justice had been served, it could never truly make up for the loss of Shelley. Shelley's mother, Judy, said, "Whatever the new technology is, I'm just so glad it came around and solved this crime. Hopefully, it will solve other unsolved cases as well." Moving on to the next case. Roger Scott Dunn. Roger Scott, born on February 10, 1967, in Lubbock, Texas, was one of 2 sons born to Jim and Mary Sue Dunn. He was known as Scott to everyone and was described as a fun-loving jokester and a ladies' man. By 1991, at 24 years old, he had left the military and settled in Lubbock, where he worked at MGM Electronics, specializing in custom sound system installations for vehicles. Scott had a passion for working on cars and had even won stereo installation competitions. Additionally, he bought, restored, and resold used cars on his own. He was in a relationship with Latia Hamilton, a 28-year-old waitress. On the evening of May 13, 1991, Scott attended a party at a friend's house. Suddenly, Scott became very ill. He was unable to walk or drive home and ended up sleeping at his friend's house. The following morning, Laisha came to pick him up so he could rest in their apartment at Oakwood Club Apartments, located at 581820 4th Street. By May 15th, Scott felt well enough to return to work. His car was still at his friend's place, so he made arrangements for his friends to give him a ride to work. Scott informed Latia about the arrangement with his friends. She made him tea before leaving for work. When his friends arrived at the apartment, Scott didn't respond to the door. Latia returned home later and told them that Scott must have left while she was at work. Scott didn't come home that night, and for the next 2 days there was no sign of him. Latia then contacted Scott's father, Jim Dunn, who lived in Pennsylvania, to inform him that Scott had disappeared. Jim Dunn reached out to the Lubbock Police Department to file a missing persons report. He explained to detectives that it was unusual for Scott to leave his beloved Camaro, known as the Yellow Submarine, and his tools at work. When the police arrived at Scott and Laisha's apartment, Laisha pointed out that a piece of carpet was missing from under the couch. The police later discovered that the missing carpet piece was in Scott's bedroom. It had been duct taped together with the carpet in the bedroom. A piece of carpet had been removed from the bedroom. Along the seam, the police noticed a rusty-colored stain. It was clear that it was blood. There was another large stain on the padding underneath the carpet in one section. The blood on the padding had seeped down to the concrete below. It also looked like someone had cleaned blood off of the baseboard of the wall. The investigators used luminol to test the room. The room lit up. It was obvious that someone, presumably Scott, had suffered a violent attack. Investigators looked at Scott's life and the people he knew to see if anything stood out to them. Scott had a previous arrest for using illegal substances. At age 23, he was arrested in connection with a Domino's pizza robbery. The police followed up on this to see if anyone might have had reasons to hurt Scott because of the substances or money. They didn't find anything useful. Looking at Scott's relationship with Leisha, investigators found a lot of oddities. It seemed that Scott wasn't able to commit to Leisha as much as she would have liked. 1 month before Scott's disappearance, Leisha had learned that Scott was engaged to another woman. Investigators saw this as a possible motive. Could Leisha have sought revenge against Scott? Scott's friends told investigators something worrisome about Leisha. A family friend of Scott said that Scott was afraid to break up with Leisha. Leisha's ex-boyfriends warned Scott that she could lather herself up into violent jealous rages. Leisha continued to contact Jim to talk about the case. Jim taped all of their phone calls. For some reason, Leisha didn't really seem that interested in finding Scott. She often talked about his sports car. She even asked Jim if she could have it. Leisha told Jim that she didn't want the car but needed it. Leisha was clearly getting impatient about having to wait for the car. This was really odd behavior. Investigators learned that Leisha had a criminal record. She had been arrested in New Mexico for embezzlement. Investigators continued looking into the possibility that she was responsible, but then she actually came up with the first suspect. Leisha told Jim that she believed a man named Tim Smith was involved in Scott's disappearance. Tim lived near Scott and Leisha and became infatuated with her. The police went to speak to Tim at his apartment and saw that he was packing up to move. Tim willingly let the police search his apartment. When the police walked back out to the room where Tim was standing, they discovered that Tim had moved a roll of duct tape that was on his bookshelf. Tim claimed he didn't move anything, but the police found it hidden behind some books. The tape was sent in for forensic testing. Using infrared lights to look at different wavelengths and components of the tape, the results were that the tape from Tim's apartment were consistent with the tape used on the carpet in Scott's bedroom. On the side of the tape, triangular green carpet fibers were found, which were the same color as the carpet in Scott's bedroom. Unfortunately, without a body, there wasn't much else investigators could do, and the case went cold. Jim got impatient and set out to find answers himself. He met with a group called the Vidic Society. It's a group of 82 international forensic experts. The group is a members-only group that meets in Philadelphia to try to solve unsolved crimes. Jim met with Richard Walter, a co-founder of the group, to go over the case of his son. Richard immediately confirmed that Scott is not alive anymore. Furthermore, he was convinced that Leisha held the answers. Richard sent the information to Dr. Richard Shepherd of New Scotland Yard. Dr. Shepherd concluded that Scott's life was taken in his bedroom and had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. He conducted multiple tests and confirmed that with the amount of blood that was lost, no one could have survived. Richard Walter begged the district attorney to take this case to trial. Richard said that they didn't have a body, but had a body part, the blood's connective tissue. Richard Walter noticed that there were unidentified hairs in the duct tape found in Scott's bedroom. It was sent in for testing and was determined to be hair from both Tim Smith and Latia Hamilton. Smith and Hamilton were finally arrested 3 years after Scott disappeared in 1994. It is believed that Scott's life was taken in the early morning hours of May 16, 1991. While he was asleep, Scott was struck 4 times with a blunt object. Hamilton and Smith tried to clean up the scene, but obviously left behind too much evidence. It is believed that Leisha wanted revenge after finding out that Scott had been seeing other women and was engaged. Smith probably helped Hamilton because she manipulated him, and he was obsessed with her. They were tried separately and both convicted. Latia Hamilton was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Smith received 10 years of probation. The jury believed that Smith had helped Hamilton clean up and dispose of evidence, but they weren't convinced he was present during the crime. The reasoning behind Leisha's relatively short sentence in Texas remains unclear, but she had to serve the full term after being denied parole multiple times. After her release, Leisha disappeared from the public eye. Unfortunately, neither Hamilton nor Smith would reveal the location of Scott's body. In February 2012, Jim Dunn received the news he had been waiting for when Victims Assistance Services in Lubbock informed him that a work crew had discovered skeletal remains in a sewage system near Scott's apartment complex. Dental records confirmed the remains were indeed Scott's. On June 16, 2012, the Dunn family laid Scott to rest in a grave marked by a stone bearing an engraving of his Camaro. Jim Dunn was quoted as saying, "I tell everyone that Scott came home for Father's Day." Moving on to the next case. Mary Pryor and Leonard. Mary Pryor and her husband, Leonard, lived in Flint, Michigan, where they owned Sweet Marie's candy store for many years before selling it. Afterward, they moved to Lennon, Michigan to enjoy their retirement. Leonard passed away in 1990, and in the years that followed, Mary became a well-known figure in the small village. A devout Catholic, Mary frequently attended church functions. Residents of Lennon would often see her walking from her home to the town diner for lunch and dinner on most days. On February 27, 1997, Michigan State Police K-9 teams, who were conducting training in the area, discovered the body of 88-year-old Mary in a wooded area near her home. She had been beaten, strangled, and assaulted. The crime sent shockwaves through the close-knit Lennon community. Investigators gathered DNA evidence at the crime scene, which was linked to the suspect. They conducted hundreds of interviews and followed up on numerous leads. The investigation soon focused on Michael Burr, a teenager who lived just a short distance from Mary's house. At the time, he was in the 11th grade. Investigators took his DNA sample so it could be stored, as DNA was not advanced enough at the time to confirm that his DNA matched what was found at the crime scene. Unfortunately, investigators could not gather enough evidence to meet the probable cause standard to charge him in connection with the case. Recently, the Genesee County Police Department partnered up with the Michigan State Police Crime Lab to finally help solve the case. In February, they were able to match the DNA found at the scene to that of Michael Burr. Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton said that DNA evidence shows 1 in 1.9 octillion chance that Michael was not responsible for what happened to Mary. Ultimately, what we want here is closure for the victim's family, he said. We want closure because when you lose a loved one in such a brutal manner, it never goes away from your mind. You never have a peaceful day when you can stop thinking about it. Michael Burr was then held in the Genesee County Jail without bond. He had a probable cause hearing in Genesee County District Court on February, where prosecutors laid out the evidence against him. The case was brought to a close in February when Michael Burr was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson shared his thoughts after the sentencing, stating, "Although Mary was not related to me by blood, my family grew up with her. I was assigned to this case as a young detective sergeant, and 21 years later here we are." He continued, "When you see people come forward and provide families with answers, especially in such a violent case like this, that's why we clip the heels and take the oath. That's why we become police officers and investigators." Swanson concluded, "Although I don't have the same relationship with Mary as the family behind me, Mary is my family, and it's a great day." Moving on to the next case. Terrence Paquette. At around 7 a.m. on February 3, 1996, the Orange County Police Department responded to a call concerning Lilsham Convenience Store, located on Clark-Ona-Ocoee Road in Orlando, Florida. A witness had reported an unusual finding that morning. He explained that while driving by the store at approximately 6:55 a.m., he noticed the lights were off, which struck him as odd since the store typically opened by that time. Curious about what might be going on, the witness tried to enter the store. However, before doing so, he parked nearby to peer through the windows. He said he didn't see any store employees, which seemed strange to him. Feeling unsettled, the witness contacted the police to express his concerns before leaving the area. Upon arriving at the scene, deputies found 2 employees from an armored car company waiting to collect a cash deposit from the store, but the door was locked. The deputies attempted to contact the store by phone, but there was no answer. They then conducted a quick search around the premises and discovered a white car parked in the lot. After running a license plate check, deputies learned that the white car belonged to the store manager, Terrence Paquette. They attempted to contact his residence to confirm if he was home, but received no response. With no way to access the store since it was locked from the outside, the deputies were at a standstill. Fortunately, another employee, who had closed the store the night before, happened to drive by and notice the police. He offered to help and provided his keys, allowing the deputies to enter. As they worked to open the door, the deputies noticed a small amount of blood on the exterior lock. Once inside, they discovered the lifeless body of Terrence Paquette in the men's restroom, lying in a pool of blood. The medical examiner later confirmed that Paquette had been the victim of a brutal attack, suffering 73 stab wounds across his neck, torso, and limbs. His heart and lungs had been severely punctured, leading to his death. Investigators noted a significant amount of bloodstains throughout the store, leading them to believe that the person responsible for Terrence Paquette's murder had also been injured. Blood was found in multiple areas, including the freezer door, the freezer flap, the lottery machine behind the counter, the key cylinder on the entry and exit door, and the door push bar. The blood pattern suggested the suspect moved through the store, starting from the restroom to the beverage freezer, then behind the cash register where money was stolen, and finally to the entry and exit door, likely where the perpetrator fled. Deputies determined that after taking about $1,000 from the safe beneath the cash register, the killer took Paquette's keys and locked the store's doors. At the time, the murder of Terrence Paquette deeply troubled both the police and his family. Paquette had arrived at Lille Champ food store between 5 and 6 a.m. to open for business, as he did regularly. Sadly, within minutes of entering the store, he was violently attacked and killed by an unknown assailant. In another, he said she was on holiday with a friend in the Canary Islands. And at other times, he simply said that he didn't know where she was. Friends of Helle grew concerned. It wasn't like the mother of three to just up and disappear without contacting anyone, and they were well aware of Richard's aggression and temperament, having had Helle tell them of the details of her and her husband's relationship. He was reportedly even physically abusive. At one point shortly before her death, she told France, "If something happens to me, don't think it was an accident." She even told this to her divorce lawyer, who described the unusualness of the statement in her interview on the TV show Forensic Files. When authorities were eventually alerted to the troubling disappearance of the 39-year-old flight attendant, they went to search the family home. One of the first things they noticed was the missing pieces of carpet from the floor in the master bedroom. The Crafts nanny recalled that there was a dark grapefruit-size stain on one of the pieces of carpet which had now been removed. This had investigators worried, and as they continued to look around, they also found evident blood smears on the side of the bed, and that a large freezer was missing from the home. As they looked into Richard Craft's bank records, they found that he had purchased several interesting items around the time that his wife disappeared: new bedsheets and a duvet, and the rental of a wood chipper. Papers that were provided to a private investigator by Richard included the receipt of a chainsaw too. The fears that family and friends of Helle Crafts held were confirmed when a snowplow driver came forward and said that he'd seen Richard at the shore of Lake Sohar. A search of the lake found the purchased chainsaw covered in blood and hair, which was later proven to match Helle. Then in or near the water, police found further evidence of foul play, including metal pieces, 85 grams of human tissue, including a tooth with unique dental work, a fingernail with pink polish, bone chips, 2,660 bleached blonde human hairs, and O-negative type blood, the same type as Helle's. From these horrifying discoveries, police concluded that the remains of Helle Crafts had been fed into the wood chipper. To test this theory out, the medical examiner used a pig's body to recreate the damage a wood chipper would cause to the bones, and it was found that the pig's bone fragments bore a similar shape to those of Helle's and had the same marks on. Investigators determined that Helle Crafts had been struck in the head multiple times, leaving the bloodstains on the carpet and the smear on the bed, and that her body was kept in a freezer before it was cut up with a chainsaw and fed through the wood chipper. The gruesome disposal of Helle's body shocked friends, family, and the local community. The prosecution of Richard Crafts required an official determination of death via body identification, which initially threw a spanner in the works of the investigation, as of course, Helle's body wasn't available. However, after a tooth found in the lake was found to match her dental records, the Connecticut State Medical Examiner's Office issued the death certificate for the mother of three. Richard Crafts was arrested in January 1987, and his trial began a year and a half later in May 1988. The first trial, which concluded in July, resulted in a hung jury. But a second trial in November 1989 led to a guilty verdict. During one of the proceedings, Richard's defense argued that Helle, being bilingual and fluent in 4 languages, could have simply disappeared, using her linguistic skills to start a new life elsewhere. However, this theory did not convince the second jury, who found the physical evidence against Richard overwhelming. Richard Crafts later appealed his conviction, but his request was denied. Helle's 3 children were placed in the care of one of Richard's sisters, who had supported the prosecution and advocated for a severe punishment. While no sentence could truly compensate for the loss felt by Helle's children, her mother, and her loved ones, Richard was given a 50-year prison term. He became eligible for parole in 2021. The Chen family tragedy. On the afternoon of October 8, 2014, a co-worker of 39-year-old Jean Jifeng grew worried when the father of 2 failed to show up for his scheduled shift at King's Walk, a restaurant where he worked. He hadn't called in sick either, which was unusual. Concerned, the co-worker decided to check on Chen at his home on Western Avenue in the Guilderland suburb of Albany, New York. What he discovered inside was a horrific crime scene. Chen and his 38-year-old wife, Hai Yilin, were originally from Huaiyu, China. The couple had moved to the United States in the early 2000s, settling in Guilderland near a takeout restaurant owned by relatives. There, they built a life together and had 2 children, 10-year-old Anthony and 7-year-old Eddie. By all accounts, the Chen family was ordinary, with nothing unusual about their lives, making their brutal murders all the more puzzling to investigators. The case gained significant attention, as it was the first quadruple homicide in the Capital District. According to Chen's brother, who spoke to the media, the father of 2 was found on the ground floor of the family's bungalow. Hai and the couple's 2 children were discovered upstairs, their bodies covered by a blanket. The family had met a brutal end. Each of them had been bludgeoned with a hammer, and later reports indicated they had also been stabbed. Investigators determined the murders took place in the early morning hours, likely between 3:30 and 6:30 a.m. Both the Guilderland and New York State Police worked together on the case, searching the areas surrounding the family's home for any possible clues. Authorities faced several challenges in the initial 48 hours of the investigation. A language barrier slowed progress, and fear within the community made gathering information difficult. Further complicating matters, there were no surveillance cameras in the area, and Apple initially refused to release the Chen's iPhone records. Though the company eventually complied, law enforcement stated that the delays significantly hindered their investigation. With little physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, detectives have struggled to make progress. Some DNA samples were collected and may belong to a suspect, but so far, no matches have been found. As a result, authorities have few leads and no major suspects in the case. Before long, allegations surfaced that the family were involved in shady business practices and illegal activities such as human trafficking, gambling, and money laundering. Chen's brother denied rumors that the family had been attacked by someone who'd returned to the house after a gambling party to steal their sizable take from the been living comfortably ever since, causing people to think that he was making money illegally. This same source alleged that Hai was in the country illegally too. Meanwhile, an article by the Times-Union reported that Chen had supposedly been involved in large transfers of unrecorded cash, which he used to pay undocumented Chinese workers at restaurants in New York City. He reportedly also transported the workers to their jobs and back and provided accommodation in cities that were too far away for bus trips. Even more damningly, 18 mattresses were found on the basement floor of the family's home. The Times-Union also claimed that the weekly card game Chen ran had racked up about $100,000 in debt. However, this is where that lead dries up. Authorities have said that while the organized crime theory hasn't been discounted, they have yet to find any solid leads in the case. The only other theory explored in the case was a possible connection between the Chen family murders and 2 other family killings that occurred around the same time. In 2014, a family of 4 was shot and killed in their Houston, Texas home. Similarly, in 2011, a married couple and the wife's sister were found stabbed to death in their Mississippi residence. However, No definitive links have been established between these crimes. By 2015, investigators had pursued 600 leads, a surprisingly low number for such a serious case. A reporter from World Journal suggested that she and her colleagues suspected the family may have known more than they disclosed. The Chan's funeral took place a month after their deaths to allow time for relatives from overseas to attend. They were laid to rest at All Faith Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. The case remains unsolved, and a $5,000 reward is still being offered for information leading to an arrest. Anyone with knowledge of the Chen family murders is encouraged to report it at capitalregionalcrimestoppers.com. https://capitalregionalcrimestoppers.com. Moving on to the next case.